On this day, Grace spoke with a hint of determination, as if to make a clean break with everything from the past. She cheerfully said she wanted a divorce from Benjamin. Hearing this, a look of shock instantly appeared on Benjamin's face. He couldn't believe his ears. His usually gentle and virtuous wife had suddenly made such a request. Grace turned her head slightly, a trace of bitterness flashing in her eyes. She continued to explain that Benjamin didn't love her, that she didn't even dare to look at his face, and that their marriage was solely for the benefit of their families. Therefore, she wanted a divorce. Benjamin's heart felt as if it had been struck by a heavy hammer, and a sharp pain shot through him. He had never imagined that Grace would say such things so bluntly. Grace took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. She stated that she guaranteed she would never regret it and would ensure she disappeared from Benjamin's sight for the rest of her life. Benjamin looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. He softly called her Lady Grace. Grace bowed her head slightly in response. At this moment, her heart was a whirlwind of emotions. Benjamin took a step forward, his eyes glistening with tears, and asked her why she was saying these things. Grace looked up in surprise, her eyes full of bewilderment. Benjamin said self-reproachfully, "Did I do something wrong? Did I offend you in some way? If there's anything you want, I'll do it. If you want me to kneel, I will kneel." He also added, "If you don't like my face, I will wear a mask for the rest of my life." He begged Grace not to leave him. Grace's heart was in turmoil. Looking at this man who was both a stranger and familiar, she couldn't help but scream internally. What on earth is this guy talking about? Doesn't he love Aria? It was a beautiful morning. When the woman had just opened her eyes, her first thought was that she wanted to die. This was followed by a strangely familiar sense of self-loathing. However, she felt that she couldn't die just yet. The woman sat listlessly on the bay window, looking at her reflection in the glass. The image was completely different from her original self. Her face was fat and covered in freckles, topped with a head of carrot-colored curly hair. Her green eyes were dull and murky, revealing the lifeless existence of this body's original owner. Her shoulders, unconsciously hunched from long periods of stooping, finally straightened. Then she leaned against the wall, realizing that this was the so-called world of a novel setting. Several weeks passed like this. She couldn't return to her original world. Now that she knew it wasn't a dream, she had no choice but to accept and adapt to the situation. However, there was a big problem here. This world was from a novel she had read just before she died, titled The Saintess's Wish. Being in a novel setting, she couldn't help but wonder if she had transmigrated. The Saintess's Wish was a very ordinary romantic fantasy novel. The protagonist, Aria, had no special qualities other than her devastating beauty, until one day she discovered she was a saintess. As the recognized saintess, Alia's fame spread across the continent. She experienced all sorts of things. Closely related to Alia was the Empire's crown prince, Sylvester. Despite being the crown prince, his position was precarious. To secure his status, he concealed the curse he bore, and this curse could be gradually lifted through contact with Alia. Up to this point, it was an ordinary romantic fantasy novel. Now that I think about it, there was a unique plot twist. If there was anything unusual in this novel setting, it was the male supporting character, Benjamin Felton. Benjamin was a duke from the north. As the northern duke, perhaps because the male lead had black hair, he was designed to be a gentle and considerate person with brown hair and green eyes, and he was already married. It is often said that brown hair and green eyes signify a gentle and considerate person, but it's hard to imagine a northern duke having a face like a puppy. What was even stranger was that he was married. The woman thought to herself, why give a married status to a man who has an ambiguous relationship with the female protagonist? It looked as if the author had watched too many infidelity-themed dramas before writing. There was really no other reason. Of course, the people around him always said it was an unwilling marriage. After muttering to herself, the woman looked up, thinking, what's the use of that now? After all, she had already possessed this body, and the symptoms were gradually assimilating with it, and her memories were incomplete. Even complaining about why she was reincarnated into this body was useless. like spilled water, even if she wasn't the one who spilled it. As the woman hunched over, lost in thought, the maid standing in the corner panicked. One maid asked if she should bring her favorite food. Another said she had also prepared a lot of her favorite tea. Another maid mentioned that the new limited edition tea set had arrived. Since possessing this body, she hadn't left the room, which left everyone at a loss. But at least things were getting better now. After all, she had just arrived in a world she had never seen before and possessed someone else's body. It was impossible to act so calm from the beginning. She refused the maid's suggestions. The maids looked at her, almost on the verge of tears. She looked at the blurry reflection in the window, gently pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and muttered softly, "Maybe I should go out for some air." The maids heard her muttering and jumped up in excitement. One maid praised the idea as brilliant. Another said she would go prepare her clothes. Another maid said that putting on her favorite clothes and going for a walk would surely lift her spirits, and reminded her that she needed to take a bath first. Everyone moved quickly, giving her no chance to change her mind. She stood up from her seat. Her heavy body made it very uncomfortable to move. Her reflection appeared in a nearby mirror. She stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. Seeing this, a maid's face turned pale, and she asked if she should put the mirror away. She refused. She knew why the maids were so uneasy. When she possessed this body, she accepted the original owner's memories. The original owner hated her appearance very much. This was probably the reason for her ever-increasing self-loathing. It was terrifying. She had to repeatedly remind herself that she was not the original owner of this body, but another person, just to get rid of this self-loathing emotion. In fact, the original owner didn't look that bad before. Due to spending a long time indoors, her muscle mass decreased and her weight increased. At most, one could say she looked very ordinary. However, the original owner didn't seem to think so. The maid informed her that the bath water was ready and asked if she could attend to her today. She shook her head and walked into the bathroom alone. She found it embarrassing to have someone attend to her while bathing. Fortunately, the original owner also disliked having someone attend to her during her bath. As she soaked her body in the warm water, she guessed that the original owner disliked revealing her body. Anyway, the long-awaited bath made her feel a little better. Some of her previous pessimistic thoughts also disappeared. Most of the clothes in the wardrobe were dark-colored. In her opinion, the styles were all very similar, but the maids were still diligently picking them out. Because this was her first time going out for a walk in a long time, she had to wear a beautiful dress. She wore a dark blue dress with almost no lace or ribbon decorations. When she walked out of the door, confidently, everyone showed a surprised expression. She rarely went out before, and since coming here, she hadn't taken a single step out of her room. But even so, she didn't back down. In fact, she tried her best not to back down. Instead of going to the usually deserted backyard garden, she walked towards a luxurious garden near the front door. The gardener was startled to see her and hid. From up close, this garden was even more vibrant and splendid than what she saw through her room's window. The maid following behind her said with a beaming smile, "The master ordered to make sure the garden view can be seen from the lady's window." She mentioned the master with a questioning tone. The maid nodded her head vigorously in affirmation, like a puppy eager for praise. She found this ridiculous, thinking as if that's true. She knew the original owner's situation all too well. While she was distractedly listening to the maid's chatter, she heard footsteps. Benjamin appeared, calling her lady. The wind rustled the leaves. The two stood face to face. Benjamin asked her why she was here. She retorted, "Shouldn't I be here?" Benjamin said that's not what he meant and blinked. Benjamin's warm brown hair was more beautiful than any color. His green eyes were as clear as jade. The handsome man smiled gently and explained that he was worried. Hearing the word worried, she sneered in her heart, thinking it was utter nonsense. The man standing opposite her was Benjamin Felton. He was the male supporting character in the novel The Saintess's Wish, and the owner of the body she possessed was Grace Felton. This character had never appeared directly in the novel. She was the wife of this male supporting character. Grace Felton's name before marriage was Grace Linden. As a woman from a minor noble family, she could not add power to the Felton ducal family, so she was forced into this marriage by the royal family. Although her family had a long history as nobles, Grace was just the daughter of a viscount who was now no different from a common farmer. If it weren't for this forced marriage, she would never have had any connection with the Felton ducal family. Grace and Benjamin met only 3 times before their wedding. Shortly after, she no longer appeared in social circles. Grace glanced back at Benjamin walking behind her. Whenever Grace looked back, Benjamin would smile. Then Grace would turn her head forward again with a heavy heart and walk on. Their marriage was forced by the royal family. According to the few memories of Grace that she retained, they had not even fulfilled their marital duties, let alone kissed at the wedding. Their marriage was merely a product of a complex relationship, not a real marriage. Despite this, Grace's life was quite comfortable, living off the wealth of the ducal family. However, in the latter half of the story, Grace died of an unknown illness. Grace trembled, remembering the future that awaited her. Benjamin saw her tremble and asked with concern if something was wrong. Grace replied that it was nothing. Benjamin then guessed she was cold and asked if she wanted to go inside. After all, she hadn't been out for a long time, and it might be uncomfortable to stay outside. Grace again said that she was really fine. As Grace had recalled earlier, she never appeared directly before the end of the story. She felt that a character like her, who had never appeared even once, couldn't be called a supporting character, but was merely a part of the story setting. Even her death was not described in detail. What Benjamin said at her funeral, that she died of an illness, was all there was about her death. This information made it so that no one could say more about the cause of the Duchess's death. After Grace's death, Benjamin began to show his true colors. With his brown hair and green eyes, he was thought to be a trustworthy and affectionate man. But the author seemed to want to catch the readers off guard by making him the ultimate villain who opposed the male and female protagonists. He tried to kidnap the female protagonist and even wanted to kill her. Driven by repeated obsessions, he ended his own life in the female protagonist's arms. A person like that might even fake his wife's illness, then kill her just to get the female protagonist. Although the novel didn't explicitly mention this, as Grace, who loved Benjamin the most, she couldn't help but have such suspicions. When Grace read this novel, she firmly believed that Benjamin was definitely not just a male supporting character. Benjamin would often mention his wife's story to the female protagonist, Aria. Grace liked Benjamin because of his domestic side and kind nature, not because of his obsession and madness for the female protagonist. Grace recalled Benjamin's confession to Alia before he died, saying that he just wanted to live happily with the Alia he loved. Grace accepted all of this calmly, but she also felt betrayed by him. She felt that indeed, no one could truly fall in love with a wife like her. Despite this, Grace's heart still felt uneasy. This was the original Grace's feeling for Benjamin. After a short walk, Grace, who had returned to the annex, lay on the sofa as if dead. Actually, she wanted to walk a little more, but couldn't because Benjamin was following her like whale feces. Grace thought to herself, if I wanted to walk alone, why not just tell Benjamin not to follow? But she couldn't refuse Benjamin. This wasn't a matter of personal preference. She didn't want to offend him by telling him to go away. After all, the last thing she wanted to do was offend Benjamin, and thus accelerate the process of her death from an unknown illness. Of course, it was not yet certain that Benjamin had killed Grace. But thinking of her death from an unknown cause, Grace still trembled. A maid asked Grace if she wanted her to light the fireplace, or if she felt too cold, she could turn on the heat for a while. Grace waved her hand and said no, it was fine. Grace looked at the maids. Even though she was lying on the sofa without any dignity, the maid said nothing and showed no signs of discomfort. Grace lifted her heavy body and said she was hungry. Hearing Grace say she was hungry, the maids' faces lit up with joy. They asked if they should prepare a meal for her in the dining room, or if she preferred, they could prepare it and bring it to her room. Grace's eyes widened, and she cautiously asked if she could eat in her room. A maid nodded. Grace's gaze turned to the balcony. She then asked if she could eat there. The maid said she could do whatever she wanted. After the maids left, Grace stood there blankly. She looked at the closed door for a while, then walked to the window and sat down. Grace looked down at her plump hands. The window frame cast a shadow on them. She felt she wasn't just a little fat, but very fat. To others, whether she was a little fat or very fat, she just looked overweight. She tried to think on the bright side, but ended up in a state of depression. She couldn't help but wonder if her original self was dead. In her original life, it wouldn't have been surprising to die at any moment. At that moment, Grace heard a breathing sound coming from somewhere. She froze on the spot and suddenly looked up, wondering if she had misheard. There was no one else in the room but her. However, her heart was pounding violently. She felt uneasy in her heart, certain that she had definitely heard something. Somewhere, after the breathing sound, came a disgusting laugh. It was a piercing, mocking laugh. Just then, there was a knock on the door. A A maid announced that she had brought her meal. With the knock, Grace's thoughts were suddenly interrupted. She took a sharp breath, looked at the door, and softly replied, "All right." Hearing the response, the maid opened the door and placed a basket with hot soup and bread on a tray. She explained that since she hadn't eaten much, she had prepared some light food. Grace expressed her thanks. Since living as Grace, she hadn't left her room for several days and had eaten almost nothing. To accommodate her situation, the maid brought her a light meal. Grace noticed the maid's thoughtfulness and slightly raised the corners of her mouth to express her gratitude. The maid asked if she could place the meal there. Grace hummed in agreement. The maid placed the tray with the plate on the empty space next to Grace, then took a few steps back. Grace picked up a piece of bread and tore it. The bread still had the aroma of freshly baked butter. She tasted it and thought it was delicious. As she chewed, the sweet and rich flavor melted smoothly in her mouth. Grace slowly chewed the bread, seeming to struggle to digest all the thoughts that had just flashed through her mind. As she dipped the remaining half of the bread into the soup, a carriage being prepared outside caught her attention. She wondered what that was. At this moment, Benjamin, dressed more neatly than before, hurried out of the main gate and got into the carriage. Grace, with bread still in her mouth, stared at the carriage and asked the maid if she knew where the master was going. The maid didn't expect Grace to ask such a question and looked at her in surprise. Grace asked again. The maid said she thought she knew. Hearing this, Grace turned her head in the direction where the maid was standing. The maid hesitated whether to answer Grace's question. Seeing this, Grace questioned the maid, "Are you staying in the annex not to serve me, but to monitor me?" The maid hurriedly denied it, saying it wasn't like that. Grace then demanded the maid to answer the question quickly. Only then did the maid reluctantly inform her that the master had gone on a trip to the Rondel Canal for his duties. Grace slowly repeated the name, Rondel Canal, savoring its pronunciation. Then she asked if the Saintess Alia happened to be there as well. The maid replied that she had heard a grand purification ceremony and worship service was being held at the Rondel Canal today. Grace thus concluded that Saintess Alia was there. She then shifted her gaze from the maid to the window, seeing the empty garden and her own blurry reflection. She said she understood. She felt there was no need to go to the mirror to check her appearance again. After all, her looks wouldn't suddenly change just by looking in the mirror again. Grace gently tapped the freckles on her cheek with her index finger, feeling the rough texture of her skin. She thought that since she rarely saw the sun, her complexion was dull and grayish. The hair that the maids had carefully styled was now frizzy and sticking up. No matter how gorgeous the clothes were, they couldn't hide the thick neck wearing a pearl necklace. At this moment, a voice in her head mocked her. She empathized with this voice, feeling that she was indeed like that. Suddenly, Grace came to her senses and found the maid looking at her with concern. She comforted the maid, saying it was nothing. But that strange voice still echoed in her mind, making her uneasy and uncomfortable. She couldn't help but wonder if she was overthinking things to have such thoughts. Although Grace had never seen Alia in person, she knew what she looked like because the author often praised Alia's beauty in the novel's narrative. Alia had hair as white as pure snow, golden eyes as dazzling as the sun, flawless and smooth skin, and a model's figure, the complete opposite of herself. It seemed that Benjamin couldn't help but be attracted to Alia. The maid, watching Grace silently stare out the window for a while, didn't know what to do. After observing the maid's reaction through the window, Grace announced her decision to exercise. The maid asked in surprise, decided what? When she learned that Grace was going to exercise, she confirmed again, "Really exercise?" Grace responded affirmatively, explaining that exercising was not to lose weight and become beautiful, but because she was worried about her current physical health. She had finally obtained a body that could move freely. It would be too unworthy to get sick and die before she had a chance to live properly. And her current body had too little stamina. She couldn't run a few meters without collapsing and gasping for breath, almost fainting. It was similar to her previous life, where she couldn't walk, but was equally weak. So she hoped to live a healthy life with this body, having a healthy body in mind. Her determination to improve her physical fitness and lose weight was also for the sake of divorce. Grace wanted to live a long life. Given that Benjamin was already involved with Alia, she didn't know when Benjamin might kill her. She had never left the estate and didn't know how far the novel's plot had progressed. She was anxious because she didn't know when she would die, but she also understood that people never know when they will die. So, To survive, she had to divorce Benjamin as soon as possible. This way, Benjamin would not see her as an obstacle and would not be in a hurry to kill her, although it was not yet certain whether Benjamin was the real cause of the original Grace's death. Grace wanted to lose weight before the divorce for two reasons. First, if she divorced with her current appearance, rumors like that ugly woman was abandoned would spread even more fiercely. Being a little thinner would make her look less pitiful. Second, dieting is easier when you have money. With a lot of money and servants, she wouldn't have to worry about unnecessary things. She could buy expensive ingredients and exercise anytime without much extra effort. She believed that having an environment where she could focus on managing her body was a great blessing. No matter what others in the estate thought of her, Grace was still the Duchess, and a Duchess who didn't manage household affairs at that. But she didn't care. There was no need to refuse the comfortable life others provided. Of course, as the mistress of the house, not managing the estate's affairs meant she was very incompetent in this area. The current Grace was indeed like that. Even if she were asked to manage the estate's finances, she could only look at numbers and charts. So Grace decided to control her diet and exercise from now on. The maid was surprised by this. Grace emphasized that she was serious. Grace was determined to lose weight, divorce Benjamin, and then live alone for a long time, far away from this tragic story. The basic principles of dieting are a balanced diet, a regular lifestyle, and moderate exercise. In Grace's current situation, due to her lack of activity, she couldn't start with high-intensity exercise. Her maximum activity was just walking in the garden behind the annex. Her stamina was worse than a fawn's, and this world had no concept of sportswear. She didn't need sportswear at the beginning anyway. Grace looked at herself in the mirror and asked the maid if there were any clothes that fit well, not too big. If there were, she should bring them to her. The maid, seeing Grace's sudden change in behavior, swallowed hard, because Grace used to hate exposing her body and was always in a hurry to cover herself up. Grace didn't notice the maid's strange behavior and continued, "If there are no clothes that fit, just alter the existing ones to be smaller. Should I call a tailor?" The maid asked if she was planning to make a new dress. Grace thought for a moment, then nodded, saying that if the allocated budget allowed, she should make one. She also asked if there was someone who was skilled and could make various styles of clothes. The maid observed Grace's expression and asked if she should call the person she usually called, her voice revealing a hint of nervousness. Grace didn't notice and nodded, saying that would be fine. She felt that calling a new tailor and letting more people know about her current state would do her no good. This state included being fat, having freckles, and frizzy hair. Grace absently fiddled with her tangled, carrot-colored hair and let it fall again, feeling that it was just because she looked this way. But this was not her current thought, but an emotion remaining in her body. She just hoped she could move. She just needed to be healthy. Grace stared blankly at her reflection in the mirror, not knowing how much she hated herself. Feeling the maid watching her, she gestured for the maid to leave. After confirming she was alone in the room, Grace drew all the curtains. After she possessed the body, she couldn't immediately adapt to being Grace. At first, she was tormented by various negative thoughts and a strange sense of powerlessness. She wanted to die, but could do nothing. After finally breaking free from the pain, she realized her body could move freely. She also realized that this place was not the hospital she used to be in. It was only after looking in the mirror for a while that she understood she was in the world of a novel. After coming to her senses in this body, Grace had been looking for Grace's diary. The study had been thoroughly searched, but there was no trace of the diary. Her memory was now blurry. For now, she tried to minimize contact with others to avoid revealing any flaws. But as time went on, the limitations would become more and more obvious, and she knew that she couldn't stay in this estate after the divorce. However, she couldn't ask the maids who she was. The only thing she could rely on now was the diary that the original Grace had always kept. But because her memory was blurry, she couldn't remember where the diary was placed. Grace was sure the diary must be somewhere. She thought it would have been great if she had realized this world was from a novel right after she was reincarnated. She thought this while carefully searching under the bed, the most classic hiding place. Then she corrected her thought, thinking that if she had known earlier that this world was from the Saintess's wish, she would have definitely despaired. After all, she was Grace Felton. However, the space under the bed was empty. Afterward, Grace searched the wardrobe and drawers one by one. She thought to herself, Grace is a character who never appeared directly, was only slandered, and suddenly died of a mysterious illness. Besides, no one cared if these things were true. Only she, the current victim, cared. If she had realized this situation from the beginning, she would never have been able to accept it. But now that she knew this was reality and realized she was Grace, she had no choice but to accept it. While Grace was lost in thought, she discovered a hidden compartment under the jewelry box. She couldn't help but ask herself, could it be here? She muttered, this is also a pretty classic hiding spot. Then she opened the hidden compartment. However, there was only a ring inside. Grace picked up the ring with a helpless expression, discovering that the diary that was supposed to be here was not. The ring shimmered slightly even in the dark, but it looked cheap and outdated, not befitting the status of a ducal family. It was even less valuable than a trinket used for decoration in a jewelry box. And the gem in the middle was just a red glass bead. Grace stared at the ring for a while, then put it back. She felt terrible. Staring at the ring made her nauseous, and her stomach churned. She felt that if she kept staring, her heart would burst with a terrible feeling. A knock on the door interrupted Grace's anxious thoughts. A voice from outside said, "It's Sally." Grace briefly wondered who Sally was. After searching her memory, she remembered that Sally was the only blonde maid who was particularly kind to her. So she responded, "Come in, Sally." Sally opened the door and walked in, carrying a silver tray. On it was a teapot, a few cups, and a small envelope. Grace looked at what Sally had brought and asked what it was. Sally replied that it was medicine. Grace repeated medicine with a confused look. Sally, in turn, looked at her with a suspicious expression. Grace explained that she had already taken her medicine and apologized for being absent-minded recently. Grace inexplicably broke out in a cold sweat and added, "Maybe because I haven't taken a medicine for a while, I forgot." Sally listened quietly to Grace's vague answer and placed the silver tray on the small table. Grace anxiously watched Sally's every move. Counting 1, 2, 3, she found there were 4 pills in total. She searched her memory, but had no impression of these pills. She thought maybe the diary had information about this. Sally continued, "The lady hasn't been taking her medicine recently. The master was very worried when he found out and asked me to make sure the lady takes it." Hearing the master, Grace didn't pay much attention at first. When Benjamin's name was mentioned, her eyes widened slightly. Benjamin knew that Grace hadn't been taking her medicine recently. At this moment, Grace's gaze was fixed on the envelope containing the pills, wondering to herself, "I've been a bit dazed lately." She pondered how she had taken this medicine before. Sally didn't respond to Grace's question for a while. Then Sally informed Grace that the master had brought this for her health. Grace was surprised by this and repeated, "For my health." Sally gave an affirmative answer and seemed to know no more about it. Grace thought to herself, "Sally doesn't even know what kind of medicine this is, and they're giving it to me." This made her feel uneasy. However, she didn't show it. Instead, she asked Sally if she could tell the master that she apologized for making him worry. Sally agreed to convey the message. Grace then requested Sally to leave the teapot, saying she wanted to drink more water. Sally didn't ask any more questions and left the room. After Sally left, Grace confirmed that no one was around, then rewrapped the pills and tightly placed them in the drawer of the bedside table. At first, she thought, "This is the medicine he got for me." Then she corrected her thought, "Could this be the medicine he's using to kill me?" Grace couldn't trust Benjamin like others could. She knew what Benjamin was capable of, and she knew that Grace would die mysteriously from an unknown illness. Grace thought that she hadn't left this estate for a while, and the original Grace probably never would have. As long as she was in this ducal estate, she would always be surrounded by Benjamin's people. She couldn't help but guess, did Benjamin plan to kill me from the beginning? And she thought it probably wasn't so. Grace thought that the food in the annex was perfect. In other words, the taste was too perfect, not conducive to weight loss. The people in the annex, whenever they saw her slightly sad, would try to bring her delicious food. And those foods were all very tasty. Just thinking about them made her drool. It was easy to eat too much if she wasn't careful. She muttered to herself as she walked towards the kitchen, planning to have the kitchen change the menu to something lighter starting tonight, while also reducing the portion sizes. She had never expected Benjamin to know all this. Grace poked at the salad with almost no dressing with her fork, thinking to herself, "This is not enough." She thought the salad tasted good. She had never thought that a dish made only with vegetables could be so delicious, not even when she knew in the past that the taste of a salad lies in the dressing. But she still felt it wasn't enough. Although her stomach was full, her heart still felt empty. Grace believed that at this rate, her dependence on carbohydrates could be considered an addiction. What comforted her was that after eating the salad, the rumbling in her stomach subsided. She drank some cool water and asked the maid if the tailor had said he would come today. The answer was that he was scheduled to arrive before lunch. Grace looked at the empty plate in disappointment and got up from her seat, thinking she had to get used to the situation, because the more she ate, the more her appetite would grow. She also felt she should prepare to welcome the tailor. At this moment, the butler asked if he should prepare tea and snacks. This question made Grace hesitate for a moment. She considered that as the hostess, she should offer her guest a cup of tea, but she wasn't sure if it was also necessary to prepare cookies. Then someone else asked if they should prepare tea and snacks. Grace thought they should. She felt the tailor worked hard, and it was right to treat him. In fact, the staff were all hired and paid by Grace, so there was no need to prepare tea. But considering the etiquette of dealing with people, and since Grace was not a thick-skinned person, she felt that since she was going to have tea anyway, she should at least prepare something for the guest, otherwise she would feel bad. She also thought that if the Felton estate didn't offer refreshments, rumors would spread. She was already a lazy and incompetent mistress who didn't manage the estate's affairs. She couldn't be careless in entertaining guests. Then she sighed deeply and ordered everything to be prepared without any shortcomings. She also specifically emphasized that she would not eat anything and told the maid to remember this. At this moment, Grace's stomach rumbled. The thought that people around her might have heard it made her face turn red. She decided to drink more water before the tailor arrived. Later, the tailor arrived at the reception room of the annex and said he had come to see the Duchess. Grace replied, "Please come in." The tailor greeted Grace politely. Grace silently admired the tailor's polite attitude, wondering if this politeness was normal, because she had expected to be immediately ignored due to her bad reputation. The tailor, unaware of Grace's nervous worries, walked into the living room and explained to Grace that because she was making a new dress, he had brought a sample book. Grace sat on a long sofa and took the sample book from the tailor, looking at it carefully. To be honest, just by looking at these dresses, she couldn't judge the current fashion trends. The original Grace had always lived in the annex, and the current Grace had not been here for long. Among the many dress styles, a deep teal dress with gold embroidery caught Grace's eye. She couldn't help but exclaim that this dress was quite beautiful, thinking it was beautiful and elegant. While the tailor was organizing various fabric samples, he noticed Grace's gaze lingering on a certain page and asked if she liked that dress. Grace nodded, saying she thought that dress was very beautiful. However, she felt a bit uncomfortable at that moment and didn't have the courage to say more of what she was thinking. Just as Grace was about to express her opinion further, the tailor spoke first. He told Grace, "Pardon my forwardness, but that dress is not suitable for you." He also said that Countess Cottenden had also made a dress of the same style. If Grace wore the same one, she might be inexplicably ridiculed. The original Grace was timid and cowardly, always caring about what others thought, and even felt depressed because of it. So, even if the tailor invited by the Duke insulted and belittled her, she could only endure it silently. In places where there were no other servants, the tailor would subtly belittle Grace with a kind tone, and Grace used to think it was all her fault. Now Grace thought the tailor was a real lunatic. Her green eyes sparkled. Grace gripped the sample book tightly with both hands, waiting for the tailor to continue. The tailor began to introduce a certain design. Grace directly commented that the design was too tacky. The tailor asked in surprise, "What did you say, my lady?" Grace threw the sample book towards the tailor. The sample book landed open on the table. She emphasized again, "I said it's too tacky." The tailor tried to explain, smiling and saying, "This is because my lady doesn't quite understand." Grace questioned, "What don't I understand?" The tailor asked again. Grace then demanded the tailor to clarify what she didn't understand and looked at the tailor with an angry face. The tailor, relying on his experience dealing with many noble ladies, confidently explained to Grace, "My lady only stays in the annex, so you are not very familiar with the situation." Grace listened quietly to the tailor's words, seeing that he didn't even wipe the saliva from the corner of his mouth. Then Grace rang the bell next to her. The maid Sally, who was waiting outside, came in. Grace asked Sally if she often went to the city. Sally eagerly replied in the affirmative. Grace then asked Sally if she could do her a favor here. Sally looked at Grace with a confused expression. Grace explained to Sally, "Because I only stay in the annex, I'm not very familiar with the latest trends. I feel I don't have much aesthetic sense, so I need Sally's help. She said this with a frustrated expression. While staying in the annex, Grace learned that all the servants in the annex were very friendly to her. She secretly guessed if this was because they wouldn't be severely reprimanded if they made mistakes while working. After all, even if her relationship with Benjamin was not good, she was still the Duchess, and the pay was higher than in other noble households. Grace told Sally that this time she just wanted to order some clothes that were easy to move in, but the tailor kept recommending expensive dresses, wondering if she hadn't expressed herself clearly enough. The tailor asked in surprise, "My lady, why are you suddenly like this?" Grace continued, "There was one I liked, but the tailor said it didn't suit my figure. Although I agree with that." Sally looked at the tailor with eyes as if she had seen her father's murderer, while Grace, with her eyes downcast and a sad expression, didn't see Sally's expression. The tailor panicked and interrupted Grace's words. "When did I ever say such a thing to you, my lady?" Sally coldly said to the tailor, "The lady is speaking. Why are you interrupting her?" The tailor fell silent. Grace said weakly, "It's okay. Don't be angry, Sally." She then said, "Maybe it's because I'm more at ease in front of you, Sally." The atmosphere around Sally became tense because of Grace's words. From Grace's actions, she realized that the tailor's behavior was not a one-day affair. Grace looked at the tailor whose face had become stiff and told Sally, "Maybe it's better to hire a new tailor. After all, I do need a few different dresses." Then Grace smiled and asked Sally to call for a carriage. Sally bowed and went out. The tailor said to Grace, "My lady, you can't do this to me. Do you know how much effort I've put into fitting you so far?" Grace stood up from her seat, looked at the tailor with pity, and kicked the sample book on the floor, saying, "That's not something I need to know." The tailor retorted, "What did you say, my lady?" Grace replied with a cold smile, "Whether a popular design suits my figure, why should I consider that? The master must be paying you a lot, so you should provide value commensurate with the money I pay." Grace then questioned, "Explain to me why I should understand that the money you receive and your ability don't match." The tailor fell silent. Grace added, "If you can't make clothes well, at least you should have a sweet tongue. But it seems you can't even do that." She then told the tailor to get out. Grace no longer paid attention to the tailor and left the reception room. After leaving the reception room, Grace thought, was that really okay? She came to her senses and felt that maybe because she was hungry, she had been a bit too sharp just now. But then she affirmed herself, thinking she had done the right thing. She thought if she had more power, she would have directly shut down the tailor shop and made them heavily indebted, not just cut off their source of income. A few days later, Benjamin suggested having tea with Grace. Grace hesitated, not wanting to go in her heart, but unable to refuse Benjamin's invitation. She worried about when Benjamin's mood might turn sour. Benjamin told Grace that he had bought cakes from a bakery that was very popular among ladies. He also mentioned that since coffee was also very popular recently, he had brought some as well, asking Grace if she could have coffee. Grace's face lit up, thinking to herself, it's coffee. She recalled that before she transmigrated, she hadn't drunk coffee for a long time because it made her uncomfortable. After transmigrating, in this world where tea was mainstream, she hadn't even seen a single coffee bean. Benjamin called out to Grace. Grace snapped out of her daze, cleared her throat, and replied that she was fine. The worried and restless Benjamin, hearing Grace's reply, breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. After sitting down, Grace carefully observed Benjamin, thinking to herself, if I hadn't read the original novel, I might have mistakenly thought that Benjamin really liked me. Benjamin smiled shyly and pushed all the desserts and cookies in front of Grace. Grace said that just a little tea and snacks would be fine. Benjamin asked why. Grace replied that she was on a diet. Then Grace took a sip of the coffee in front of her. She felt that this coffee was much better than any Americano she had ever had in her life. She couldn't help but wonder, coffee is just becoming popular now. How can it be so good? At this moment, Grace was attracted by the aroma of the coffee and didn't notice the expression on Benjamin's face, nor did she notice that Benjamin's voice became stern when he asked if this was related to that tailor. Grace just briefly thought that the coffee cup and teacup were indeed different, which was quite interesting. Then she vaguely replied, it's for health. Being too fat is not good, and it doesn't look good either. Benjamin was silent for a moment after Grace's casual reply. Then his voice became gentle again. Come to think of it, this is related to the tailor I recommended. Hearing this, Grace looked up, thinking, is Benjamin going to blame me for driving away the tailor? Just as she was about to explain, Benjamin showed an extremely warm smile and informed Grace that the tailor had been permanently exiled overseas and his property had been confiscated. Grace was surprised by this. Benjamin said nonchalantly with a smile, "It's very fortunate. As the lady often says, evil people should be punished according to the law." He didn't even dare to look Grace in the eye, trembled all over, and his face was as pale as a corpse. He looked more like someone who should go to a temple or a member of parliament, rather than someone who makes clothes. Grace thought, the tailors Benjamin brings are all abnormal. She wanted to know the reason, then thought it might be because this was Benjamin. Felton, Sally, with a radiant smile, cleared the cups next to Grace. Grace pondered for a moment and asked Sally, who seemed to be in a very good mood today, why that was. Sally said it was because of the tailor who was permanently exiled last time. Grace made an affirmative sound. Sally continued, that tailor was found dead at the border. Grace made a questioning sound again. Sally said, it turns out he was even worse than everyone thought. Today is really a good day. Since the lady is on a diet, how about we have some beef or something to celebrate? Grace asked hesitantly, celebrate what? Sally replied, as if it were a matter of course. An unnecessary energy consumer has disappeared from the world. Isn't that worth celebrating? The world should be full of precious and beautiful things. Grace's expression froze awkwardly. Seeing this, Sally covered her mouth and said, my lady doesn't like that kind of talk. I apologize for that. I hope I didn't make my lady uncomfortable for no reason. Grace said no. Sally asked again if the lady was really okay. She also asked, my lady won't suddenly have nightmares, have no appetite when eating, or have her heart race at the sight of a dress, remembering that person, right? The maid asked Grace if she was going out today. Grace replied that she should at least go for a walk. Grace stood up, feeling a bit lighter than before. The new dress made by the new tailor was an optimized garment. To facilitate movement, it had almost no jewelry decoration nor any lace frills. So Grace put on comfortable shoes and dressed simply. She had asked the new tailor to make the shoes, and the tailor didn't ask her why she ordered such simple shoes. Grace had no doubts about this because it was very convenient for her. The only problem Grace thought of was that Benjamin appeared every time she went for a walk. She wondered why. When Benjamin met Grace, he said, what a coincidence to meet you again today. Grace asked if the master was also out for a walk. Benjamin said the weather had been very nice recently. Grace had previously always gone for a walk at a fixed time. The first day, Benjamin was not there. The second day, he appeared during her walk. After that, they met every day. Grace felt uneasy and changed her walking time, but she still ran into Benjamin. Benjamin always smiled brightly and claimed it was a coincidence. Grace believed it was not just a coincidence. She felt that as a noble, excellent, and busy Duke of the Empire, Benjamin wouldn't have so much free time. Most importantly, if this was not a coincidence, Grace's main thought was why Benjamin wanted to come out for a walk with her. Benjamin mentioned to Grace that he was considering planting some new trees in the garden. He also asked Grace, you used to like peaches, how about planting a peach tree? Grace made a hesitant sound. Benjamin then asked Grace if she didn't like peaches anymore. Grace replied that if he gave them to her, she would eat them. Grace added that because she was on a diet, she couldn't eat them. Benjamin's face darkened again. Grace said she liked flowers, but didn't know much about the types of flowers. Since she didn't know the names of the flowers, she couldn't tell what they were. Benjamin said he understood, saying he hadn't considered such a problem before. The servants, observing the two of them from the side, felt an unbearable sense of frustration. Although they couldn't know exactly what Grace and Benjamin were thinking, it was obvious that their thoughts were completely different. Grace made a discovery and exclaimed. Sally asked what was wrong. Grace pointed to the chemise she had been wearing for a while and said with a smile, has this shirt gotten a bit loose? It was indeed true. This shirt was looser than before. Of course, because Grace had a lot of body fat, she could easily lose weight just by adjusting her diet. But after losing a certain amount of weight, she would have to do more strenuous exercise than just walking. Sally looked at Grace, her face showing a radiant smile that Sally had never seen before. Sally also smiled gently. Grace thought to herself that she had probably lost 7 or 8 kilograms. She felt that if she had lost this much, she should propose a divorce. Sally, unaware of Grace's inner thoughts, smiled lightly and asked Grace if she was also going for a walk today. Grace said that if she didn't go for a walk today, she would always want to be lazy and not go for a walk. Grace thought from Benjamin's perspective, speculating how much he longed to be able to legally date Aria. Benjamin was indeed Grace's type before, but when she discovered that Benjamin was using her to gain Alia's favor, all her feelings for Benjamin hit rock bottom. They disappeared without a trace. After all, the wife being used was herself, and that wife died of an unknown illness. Grace couldn't help but curse. Today, her mind was full of thoughts of getting a divorce as soon as possible. Grace sighed deeply, then walked toward the garden. Grace made a questioning sound because she didn't see Benjamin today. She unconsciously looked around. She thought to herself that Benjamin might not come out. After all, she had always said that their meetings were just a coincidence. And today she came out later than usual. After some thought, Grace felt like she was making excuses to avoid feeling disappointed. As Grace was staring at the main mansion, Sally brought a warm fur cape and draped it over Grace, saying, "My lady has lost a lot of weight recently. I'm very worried." Hearing the word thin, Grace touched her cheek. Sally, with a sincere and worried expression, asked Grace if something was bothering her. She also said she knew she shouldn't meddle. Grace thought that Sally had always been very good to her. Before she possessed the body, Sally was the maid who spoke to her most gently. Sally, unaware of Grace's thoughts, continued to say worriedly, "My lady hasn't been to the study recently. I was wondering if something had happened." Hearing the word study, Grace didn't understand at first, then remembered that the former Grace often shut herself in the study. She realized that at first she was busy adapting to her new body, and later she was struggling to survive, completely forgetting her original self. She used to read until she was sick of it. Grace recalled that before she possessed the body, she was always sick and could only stay in the hospital, unable to go out and play, so she always had books by her side. She explained to Sally that she preferred to move around more recently, and said that staying in a room all the time would make a person depressed. Sally's expression became even more melancholic after hearing Grace's words, because Grace had previously lived a life that was almost isolated from the world. And the life Grace was thinking of before she possessed the body was not much different from now. Although Grace's family was very wealthy, everyone ignored her. When she was hospitalized, her family rarely visited her. They only sent a few books. The Saintess's Wish was among the books she received one day. This book was completely different from the books her family usually sent her. Grace loved romantic fantasy novels, but her family felt that such novels were worthless and disapproved of her reading them. So when Grace received the Saintess's Wish, she was immediately attracted to it and read it over and over again. Grace thought to herself, "It's just some useless sentimentality." She shivered and clutched the blanket tightly. A maid asked Grace if she felt cold. Grace replied that she probably was cold. She also said that today she would go to the study, as the maid suggested. At the same time, she asked the maid to bring her some hot tea in the study. The maid said, of course, anytime. Grace shivered as she walked towards the study, wondering if the diary might be in the study. She thought of the saying, "To hide a tree, hide it in the forest." She felt that maybe the original Grace had hidden the diary in the study, so she went to the study without hesitation. Grace arrived at the door of the study and hesitated for a moment before opening it. When she saw the spaciousness of the study, she was stunned, thinking, "This is too exaggerated." Although the study in her memory was not small, and she knew there were many books inside, when she actually faced it, she was still shocked by its amazing scale. She felt that the study in her memory was not this big. As soon as Grace's body entered the study, it naturally walked towards 3 places. First, she walked towards the window, then to the sofa she was now sitting on, and finally to the desk. She immediately walked to the desk to check. She found that the first drawer was full of writing tools, paper, and bookmarks. The second drawer had beeswax and candles. The third drawer had envelopes, letter paper, and a few letters. She couldn't find the diary. She rolled her eyes and slapped the desk with her hand, thinking, "Did I remember wrong?" Repeated failures made her feel frustrated. With a bang, when Grace slapped the desk, she heard something fall in the gap of the desk drawer. She made a questioning sound and lowered her head to check the space between the desk drawers, wondering if it was a mechanism. It turned out that a book was secretly hidden in the middle. She judged that this must be a diary. She felt that Grace Felton seemed to have hidden the diary extremely carefully. Grace opened the diary. The content was written for a period of time after her marriage. She felt that the original owner was not as persistent in writing a diary as she had imagined. Some days didn't even have a date, written like a memo, but she thought it was better than nothing. While reading the diary, more stories than what was written in the diary appeared in Grace's mind. For example, the original owner actually wanted a child very much, but struggled for various reasons. Grace thought to herself, "I really don't want to know this." because the original owner had told Benjamin about this, and after seeing Benjamin's not-so-happy expression, she never mentioned it again. She sighed again. I really don't want to know. She didn't understand why she had to be hurt by something that had nothing to do with her. Suddenly, Grace looked up at the ceiling. The ceiling of the study was bluish-green, with exquisite patterns painted in gold paint, which matched her aesthetic. But she didn't like it at all. Tears welled up in her eyes, and the hand holding the diary lost its strength. When memories of Benjamin surfaced in her mind, she became more certain that Benjamin's feelings for the original owner were just fondness, not love. Grace's heart ached. She knew this feeling was not her own, but a trace left by the original Grace, but still hurt. She understood that unrequited love couldn't be ended just by wanting it to end. Grace admitted that she had had expectations, for example, like in other reincarnation novels, that her husband would fall in love with her after she changed. With the recovery of the original owner's memories, depression and unrequited love were driving her crazy. Gradually, her original self disappeared. Fortunately, the situation was not too bad. Her original life was not particularly happy, so she could quickly adapt to her current life without thinking much about her original self. The servants of the annex, seeing Grace back in the study and depressed again, were all panicked. Grace didn't know that a Save the Lady committee had been formed, and Sally was the representative of this organization. Sally walked up to Grace and softly informed her that there would be a festival in the village soon, asking if she would like to go and see it. She then introduced it as a mask festival. Grace could even wear a cloak and a mask. There were many beautiful things to see at the festival, and there were many knights present, so it should be very safe to wear a mask. Sally knew very well that Grace didn't want to show her face. Everyone in the annex knew this. Sally also mentioned that Grace was on a diet, but there would be a lot of delicious food at the festival. She suggested enjoying the food just for that day. She also said that Grace hadn't eaten much recently, almost with tears in her eyes. Her eyes were already full of tears. If it were the old Grace who cared about Sally, she would have stood up and said she would consider it. But the current Grace couldn't even sort out her own thoughts. She wondered why Sally was so nice to her, guessing if it was just Sally's nature. Grace liked Benjamin's kindness, but at the same time hated that he knew she and Benjamin were forced to marry. The supporting characters in the Saintess's Wish emphasized this at every opportunity. She had read this book so many times she was sick of it. She felt she could never expect Benjamin to fall in love with her, and worried about what would happen if she really fell in love with Benjamin before that. Grace curled up under the blanket, imagining her future. Hearing Sally holding back tears behind her, Grace finally threw off the blanket and stood up. Facing Sally, feeling dizzy and somewhat dazed for not eating much, she asked Sally why she was crying. Sally said Grace didn't look well, and she felt she couldn't help much. Grace looked at Sally, feeling a little flustered in her heart, and replied that Sally had helped her a lot. Then Grace watched Sally leave her sight and asked if she should eat something. Sally nodded in response, saying she would go prepare some soup, and asked Grace if she preferred bean soup or potato soup. Grace wondered if it would take a long time to cook bean soup. Hearing this, Sally's expression changed slightly, explaining that the chef made it fresh every day and it was always ready. Afterward, Grace lay on the new sheets that the maids had carefully selected. Although she couldn't really tell the difference between good and bad, she still praised them enthusiastically. The maids were very proud. She opened the diary again, thinking of reading it one more time. At this time, her stomach was full and her body was clean. There were a few strange parts in Grace's diary. She had already made up her mind to divorce Benjamin, but she was still surprised when she saw Benjamin's sincerity. She felt that this was not just a matter of divorce. She wanted to divorce and live well after the divorce. Since she had to live as Grace anyway, she should at least live a better life. Getting as much alimony as possible from Benjamin and then living a good life was Grace's dream. So she had to eliminate all risks. Grace opened the first page of the diary and saw that it said, "As suggested, I have decided to write a diary." She was puzzled, wondering who had suggested Grace write a diary. She also lamented that she should have been immersed in a romantic fantasy novel, but now she was doing detective work. And it was strange that the diary was written as if she were talking to someone else. Just as Grace was sorting out her thoughts, she heard a strange sound in her ear. First, there was a thump. She made a hum sound. Then there was another thump. She wondered what that sound was. Then she heard thump, thump. At this point, she realized she hadn't misheard. She looked up to see what was around her. She cautiously walked to the window and, without opening it, just peeked outside. She saw that despite the dark night, Benjamin was grinning and waving his hand. How'd he find her? Grace wondered what she should do. She was already looking at Benjamin, but strangely, she didn't open the window. But since Benjamin was going to such lengths to let her know he was there, she felt he must have something to say, so she decided to open the window. Grace unlatched the window. Benjamin, realizing Grace was willing to communicate with him, quickly straightened his bangs. Benjamin greeted Grace. "My lady is not yet asleep." Grace retorted sharply, asking Benjamin if he had a habit of knocking on the windows of sleeping people. Both of them were taken aback by this. Benjamin quickly explained that he had only thrown a small pebble. If Grace was awake, she would hear it. If she was asleep, she wouldn't be woken up. As Benjamin was making excuses, his voice suddenly trailed off. He lowered his head and rubbed his neck, admitting it was his fault. Grace asked if that was really so. Benjamin said that because Grace hadn't been out for a walk recently, he was a little worried. Grace felt her response was also rude and apologized for it. After her apology, Benjamin's expression brightened. Grace looked down at Benjamin's face curiously and asked him why he didn't send a message through the butler or come in through the annex. Benjamin informed her that he couldn't enter the annex. Grace looked at him with a puzzled expression. Benjamin was about to explain, then added that outsiders were forbidden from entering the annex. If the lady didn't allow it, he couldn't go in. Grace thought to herself that she didn't want to allow him in now either, but she couldn't say the words. Her face turned pale, confused by the actions of the original Grace in her blurry memory. Grace was at a loss for words. Benjamin hurriedly defended his past and pre-reincarnation actions, saying that he had done something wrong to the lady in the past, so it was natural for the lady to do so. Grace replied that she understood, but she didn't have the courage to ask Benjamin what wrong he had done. At this time, her memory was also very blurry, so Grace decided to ask Benjamin why he was knocking on her window to find her. Benjamin was amused by Grace's question and said that Grace's response made him so happy that he forgot to ask the main question. Then Benjamin said that there would be a festival soon and asked Grace if she would like to go with him, if she was willing. The festival was a mask festival. Under the cover of masks, everyone could hide their identity and enjoy the village festival to the fullest. Hearing Benjamin's proposal, Grace was stunned. Seeing this, Benjamin asked what was wrong with the lady. Grace's face first turned pale, then flushed, and then ashen. Even in the dark night, Benjamin could see that Grace's face was not well and called out to her. Grace eagerly interrupted Benjamin. Benjamin and Grace usually never spoke loudly, so their sudden loud voices in the middle of the night caused the lights in the servants' rooms to turn on at the same time. Grace felt that staying any longer would cause a commotion and that she had to resolve the matter quickly, so she said she was willing to go. Benjamin stared blankly at Grace, not expecting her to agree so readily. Grace, thinking Benjamin hadn't heard her, repeated loudly that she would go to the masquerade festival. After saying this, she quickly bolted the window and drew the curtains. Even though he could no longer see Grace, Benjamin continued to smile foolishly in her direction. The assistant, who had been watching from a distance, came forward and called out, "My lord." Benjamin regained the composure and grace he had lost while smiling foolishly and said they could go. The assistant thought to himself that the festival wouldn't last 24 hours, but Benjamin claimed that since his wife had made time for him, he would devote the next 24 hours entirely to her. He even wondered what he would do if the Duchess suddenly looked for him. The assistant thought there was no way the Duchess would look for Benjamin in the middle of the night. As soon as Grace heard about the masquerade festival, her face turned pale. The reason was simple. She wondered if Benjamin was inviting her to go with him. She recalled a detail about the masquerade festival from the original novel. In that plotline, Benjamin was definitely not with Grace. He wanted to be with his wife, but couldn't. So he put on a pitiful look and complained to Aria. In the novel, he even pouted pitifully at Aria. He asked Aria if she could help him choose a gift for his wife, claiming he didn't understand women's minds well. Afterwards, he expressed his gratitude by buying a gift for Aria as well. Then he figured out Aria's preferences and often bought her gifts. Whenever Aria felt burdened, he would emphasize that they were friends. Grace thought that Benjamin, in this state, was the very picture of a supporting male lead. She also recalled the characteristics of a cheating man who coaxes a naive woman. She pointed out that the first characteristic of such men is to emphasize how family-oriented they are to lower the other person's guard. It felt like laying the groundwork for his wicked deeds. Grace couldn't help but wonder if this masquerade festival was the same one from the novel. Despite her complicated feelings for Benjamin, she still agreed to go with him. She muttered to herself, wondering if the original plot would change because of this. Could it really be different from the original story? This was also why she accepted the invitation. Grace closed her eyes tightly under the covers, thinking that although Benjamin was her husband, he was truly crazy. As Grace sorted out her thoughts, her personality became a bit more cheerful, and she spoke more coherently. Grace felt very relaxed. There was nothing for her to do before the masquerade festival arrived. The staff in the annex were counting down the days. The maid spent every day pondering which cloak and mask would be most suitable for her to wear that day. After stretching and adjusting her diet, Grace felt a bit lighter. She even had positive thoughts about doing some light exercise. She also thought that the initial stage of a diet was indeed the easiest for losing weight. Grace looked at Sally. She felt that the original Grace had a poor memory, trying to recall all the memories of someone who originally had a bad memory. Only emotion-related matters came to mind. Constantly recalling the feelings of a person who had a crush on someone and a habit of self-loathing, it was inevitable to feel depressed. No matter how many times she told herself they weren't her own emotions, she couldn't help but feel down. She even lamented that emotions are contagious. When Grace stopped stretching, Sally, as if she had been waiting, came forward and asked her what she thought of the color of a dark blue cloak. Grace expressed her doubt. Sally explained that it was made from the fur of a creature called a latent. It could absorb heat, so it wasn't hot during the day and could block cold air at night. After hearing this, Grace thought the effect was very convenient. She only responded with the word creature. Then her eyes widened, and she asked how there could be a creature's fur here. She knew that unless it was of the lowest grade, a creature's fur was usually sold at auction houses first, then distributed to the Mage's Tower and the Magic Tool Association, and only then to clothing stores. And the fur of this cloak did not look low grade. It was intact and had a sheen unsuitable for an ordinary village festival. Sally claimed they found it by chance. Grace expressed her doubt. Sally once again answered affirmatively, yes, no, it wasn't. In the original novel, this cloak was a gift from Benjamin to Aria. After Grace's death, in the plot where Benjamin kidnaps Aria, he drapes his cloak over Aria and says with a smile that it suits her well. Although that smile was warm, Aria found it terrifying. Grace looked out the window behind Sally and saw the Felton Knights outside, looking slightly weary. Suspicion arose in her heart. She asked again if Sally had really found this cloak by chance. Sally naturally blocked Grace's line of sight. She insisted it was obtained by chance. Grace thought to herself, no wonder it felt bone-chilling. What if someone didn't like dark blue? Although she didn't know what kind of creature a latent was, she knew well that capturing creatures was usually troublesome and tricky. She thought they certainly wouldn't go catch a latent just to make a cloak for her. However, this cloak looked like it had just been obtained. At least, Grace had that feeling. She didn't want to be an unappreciative master, complaining about the color of a cloak made from the fur of a non-low-grade creature. So Grace asked Sally to step aside. After pushing Sally away, she walked to the window and looked out. She saw some knights huddled in a corner, looking extremely tired. Grace asked Sally again if they had really found the cloak by chance. Sally was at a loss for words, hugging the cloak tightly as she looked at Grace. Seeing this, Grace asked if it was the Lord who told Sally to say they found it by chance. Sally fell silent. Grace narrowed her eyes. Sally explained that the madam was frail and the festival was long and crowded. Grace looked at her own reflection in the window and felt that her sturdy figure had nothing to do with being frail. Sally continued, saying they hadn't just caught the latent. They had been lying in wait for several months to find it. Grace looked at Sally with a puzzled expression, not understanding what she was saying. Sally, like a drunkard confessing her sins, continued to speak. They had specially selected a team to find the latent because they weren't very active at the moment. Grace raised her hand to stop Sally from continuing. Then she frowned and fell in a deep thought, pondering how to handle this situation. Even without dwelling on why Benjamin would give her a cloak made of creatures creature fur. She felt she should give some compensation to those knights, although Benjamin would reasonably reward the knights for their labor. But she couldn't help but care. After all, it was no easy feat for the knights to lie in wait to catch such an elusive creature just to make a cloak for the Duchess. Grace squinted at the dark blue cloak Sally was holding and noticed an emerald brooch on the edge of the golden tie. Sally asked if Grace liked it. Grace said it wasn't that she didn't like it, but that she recognized the cloak. Grace knew very well that it was normal to feel fear when faced with someone who was madly showing affection. She tried to remain calm again, to compose herself. She repeatedly reminded herself that Benjamin's attentiveness was all to prove his loyalty to the royal family. Grace suppressed the panic rising in her heart and said she would wear this cloak, that it looked fine. Hearing Grace's affirmation, Sally's expression brightened instantly. Grace straightened her back, looked at herself in the mirror, and nodded in confirmation. The clock in the mirror showed it was almost time to leave. Grace walked out of the annex and saw Benjamin already waiting. Grace was wearing the cloak, while Benjamin was dressed quite lightly, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Benjamin greeted Grace, saying, "My lady has arrived." Grace asked if she was late. Benjamin replied that he had come out first, and that his lady was never late. Hearing such words, Grace thought of past memories and realized she was indeed not as emotional as before. It felt ironic. She thought that if she had heard this in the past, she would have been thrilled. Grace could be so calm because she knew that in the original story, Benjamin and Aria would meet at the masquerade festival, and the cloak she was wearing now was supposed to be Benjamin's gift to Aria. She increasingly felt that the more she knew, the more loving Benjamin seemed like a loss. She thought it was not worth suffering because of being swayed by emotions. Grace stood next to Benjamin and asked if they would take the carriage and leave through the back door where the servants go. Benjamin gave an affirmative answer and said it would be better to use different names outside. Grace blinked and asked, like what? Benjamin looked into Grace's emerald green eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his hand to carefully adjust her white mask. He seemed to want to say something, but stopped. Finally, he lowered the brim of his hat and asked Grace to call him Benny. Grace looked at Benjamin strangely, thinking he was a strange person. She felt it would be normal to call him darling, since they were husband and wife. It's just that she had never called him that. Benjamin still gripped his hat tightly and nodded for Grace to walk towards the back door first. Only after Grace took the first step did Benjamin follow behind. Even though Benjamin was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a mask, the servants could still see that his face was bright red. The servants who witnessed this sighed deeply. Someone guessed if this was the lady's first time attending a festival on the island. Someone else replied that it was possible. After all, they had been married for over a year. Benjamin nodded in agreement with this statement. Grace briefly replied that she preferred to stay indoors. Someone mentioned that Grace almost always stayed on the island and wondered why. In fact, Benjamin's main duty as a duke was to suppress the monsters in the north, while Grace was not interested in the island's social activities. Grace was just about to ask Benjamin the main reason for staying on the island, but she closed her mouth, thinking it was probably because of Aria. Just then, Benjamin extended his hand and apologized, explaining that on this busy street, it was more appropriate for him to escort Grace. He also asked if Grace wanted to hold hands or link arms. Grace hesitated for a moment and finally placed her hand on Benjamin's. Benjamin looked down for a while at Grace's hand on his. Grace called out Benny. At this moment, Benjamin's gaze was still fixed on their clasped hands. He let out a soft sigh through his thick gloves. Grace's eyes widened slightly, not understanding the meaning of this sigh. It felt as if Benjamin had sighed unconsciously, and for some reason, it seemed like a sigh of relief. Grace tried to pull her hand back, but Benjamin held it tightly and pulled it down. Then he mentioned that he had heard Grace's diet had been irregular recently. Grace admitted she was controlling her diet. Benjamin then suggested they eat something delicious that day. Hearing this suggestion, Grace was at a loss for words, because she knew that good food was an important part of the festival. The best-selling items at festivals were usually food and small, useless souvenirs. And at this moment, the tempting aroma of food filled the streets. Grace thought to herself that it was easy to restrain herself when she couldn't see the food. But this was a street full of temptation, like a feast of seduction. She couldn't help but swallow. In her heart, she also wanted to eat delicious food. After all, no one dislikes good food. Benjamin was wearing a mask, but Grace could still tell he was making a pitiful, pleading expression like a puppy. With moist eyes, he asked Grace if it was a no. Just as Grace was about to refuse, the aroma of freshly baked bread and rich butter wafted over. In addition, there was the rich, sweet smell of chocolate, the sizzling sound in the pan, the smell of freshly roasted meat, and the scent of slightly burnt sugar. The street was filled with all sorts of tempting aromas. Grace trembled helplessly and finally gave in, saying she would just have a little. Benjamin covered his mouth for a moment, looking a bit hesitant. Then he looked around and asked Grace if she could be alone for a while. Grace asked why. Benjamin said he was going to buy something to drink. Benjamin told Grace he would be back soon and it wouldn't take long. He also reminded Grace that she could look around, but to be careful of strangers, saying some people only say nice things but don't act on them. Near a place where no one was paying attention, a group of children were gathered. Grace looked around for an adult figure. Just then, a child pulled on her cloak from below and asked if she wanted to buy something. Grace saw it was a child of about 4, sniffling and looking up at her. She asked the children what they were selling. The child replied that they were selling soap. Grace turned her gaze to the goods the children were selling. Grace thought the soap was not at all good looking. After sitting down in front of the stall, she brought the soap to her nose and sniffed it. The smell wasn't special either. She thought it would be better if some other fragrance could be added. But this soap had a bland smell and a strange shape. Grace rested her chin on her hand and stared at the stall for a while, wondering if she should buy this soap. She suspected she only had this thought out of pity. Grace looked at the soap, which had no commercial value. She asked the children where their guardian was. The children mentioned a teacher. After Grace confirmed again, she was certain that the old building was an orphanage, and these children were from the orphanage. At the same time, she guessed that the teacher was probably the one taking care of these children. A terrible thought flashed through Grace's mind, and her face instantly turned pale. At this moment, a young woman hurried over from a distance, holding a large envelope in her hand. This woman, who seemed to be the teacher, noticed Grace and was startled. She asked Grace if she was a customer. Grace said she might look like one, and the child, still pulling Grace's cloak, insisted that Grace was a customer. The orphanage teacher understood the situation, sighed briefly, and apologized for it. Grace replied that it was okay. The woman seemed to know that the soap she made didn't sell well. Grace glanced at the old building, thinking that it was an orphanage. It should receive donations. Even if the amount was small, they shouldn't have children selling soap that wouldn't sell. After seeing the woman's calloused fingertips, Grace quickly understood the situation. She deduced that regardless of whether the orphanage director had absconded with the money, it was clear that funds had been misappropriated. This woman, called a teacher, not only worked odd jobs to support the children, but also seemed to be raising funds through some neglected channels. The woman incoherently said to Grace, asking if the children had brought her here, and apologized profusely for it. Grace asked the woman's name. After the woman asked in return, Grace introduced herself as Grace. The woman nodded with a blank expression and said she was Cleta Dunn. Grace confessed to Cleta that she had a lot of soap at home and didn't need to buy any. Dunn nodded with a downcast expression. Grace added that a festival is the best time to buy useless things. Grace looked towards the square. She noticed it was just past lunchtime and felt there was still plenty of time. She thought this was a sign from heaven that she shouldn't just pass by, but should lend a hand. As Grace had guessed, the orphanage was facing a financial crisis and was short on funds. Cleta was aware of this situation and thought Grace must have noticed it too. At first, Cleta suspected Grace was a loan shark. After observing her methods and means, she found them to be very different from those of a loan shark, because usually a loan shark would first try to get something as collateral. Cleta also cast her gaze on the large basket in Grace's hand and asked what was inside. Grace placed the basket on the table and replied that one basket contained tools for making and packaging soap, and the other contained candy for the children. She also explained that she had a lot of candy she no longer ate. In fact, because candy has a relatively long shelf life, there were indeed several glass jars full of candy in the annex. She took out the items from the basket one by one: glass jars of herbal tea, a press box for pressed flowers, and an alcohol spray. She mentioned that there were many types of tea and a lot of pressed flowers. To make the soap made with these materials beautiful, it needed to be transparent. Fortunately, most of the soap prepared by the orphanage was transparent. Grace mentioned that she had heard it was now popular to put flowers in tea, but she had never heard that putting flowers in soap was also a trend. Cleda's eyes widened as she watched Grace's swift and methodical actions. She asked if she often did crafts. Grace replied that it was a kind of hobby. Grace and Cleda opened the windows wide for ventilation. Grace suggested preparing the packaging while the soap hardened. Cleda agreed. Grace immediately sat down and quickly started making ribbon packaging. There were 3 layered ribbons woven from 2 different colored threads, flower-shaped ribbons, and so on. In the time it took Cleda to make 2 ribbons, Grace made 6. Cleda asked Grace if this was her hobby. Grace confirmed it was. Grace's hands were plump and very nimble, but she didn't seem to realize it. Then Grace asked Cleda about the price of these soaps. Cleda hesitated on the pricing. Grace said to set the price of the soap at 900 Senator Cleda was surprised by this, thinking the price was too high and that it would definitely not sell. But Grace was confident it would sell, reasoning that the current soap was much better than before. During the festival, food always sold well, and with so many people coming and going, they needed various ways to attract people's attention. Food could attract both sight and smell. Someone asked, wondering what that scent was, and praised how good it smelled. In a place exuding a fresh and fragrant aroma, it wasn't food, but colorful, transparent bubbles floating around. With a popping sound, the children giggled happily. Grace used cheap glass wands sold at the festival to teach the children how to blow bubbles, demonstrating to blow like this. The children followed, blowing a whoosh sound. A transparent film formed on the wand, creating a bubble. The bubble floated gently into the air. The children watched the soap bubbles Grace blew and exclaimed, "It's so pretty. It looks like a gem." Cleda felt very satisfied. Although the bubbles burst quickly, they would reappear when blown again. Grace showed the children that by dipping the glass wand into the soap solution and blowing hard, many small soap bubbles would fly out, making the children laugh heartily. In another corner, bubbles continuously rose from a basin filled with hot water and soap. The pleasant scent of the high-quality soap spread far, attracting a young couple to come and watch. The couple asked if this was soap and praised its beauty. However, they hesitated because the price of the soap was higher than what they usually used. Earlier, Grace had made up a story for Cleda. At this moment, Cleda quickly approached the couple and said that there was a legend in her hometown that if you buy soap with a pressed flower and use it all, your wish will come true. Cleda had asked Grace if there was really such a legend in her hometown. Grace replied that there wasn't, but said that passing customers might not know. The young wife found it very romantic and asked for her husband's opinion. The husband casually said to buy one then. After the couple bought the soap, other customers continued to gather around. Grace did not regret helping Cleda, believing this act was more meaningful than challenging the aid plot. She also thought that if she worked a little harder, she could sell the remaining soap and decided to use her own savings to help Cleda. According to Grace's memory, she rarely pursued luxurious pleasures, at most buying things like books. Her funds were very ample. Although she wasn't sure if she could make a profit, she still decided to try. She felt that if she failed, it would only highlight her incompetence as the Duchess of the Annex. She thought this was a gamble with her almost non-existent reputation. Even if she failed, it would just be another example proving her incompetence. She knew that if she let Cleda participate in the business and it failed, the responsibility would be hers alone. As long as Cleda was in the same situation as her, all the attention would be focused on her. Then Grace smelled alcohol from behind her. An old man roughly pushed her. She tried to steady herself, but leaned forward, and her mask fell off. Then came a dull thud. Because of the pain all over her body, she couldn't get up immediately. The drunkard looked down at Grace and sneered, his words full of mockery. He claimed he thought a statue had fallen, questioning why a woman falling would make such a loud noise. Grace was baselessly accused, and her body instantly froze. The drunkard also said she was too big, that he couldn't even dodge her, completely ignoring that he was the one staggering. Grace was speechless in the face of such accusations. The pride from dressing up for the festival and the satisfaction from her loose-fitting clothes vanished in an instant. Grace's heart trembled with anxiety. She wanted to escape, but couldn't get up. She just felt breathless, and her ears were ringing. Laughter echoed in Grace's ears. This laughter came not only from the foul-mouthed drunkard, but also from from similar voices that often echoed in her mind. Grace tried to say stop, but her mouth only stammered, failing to make any sound. Tears welled up in her eyes. After a long struggle, she finally managed to squeeze out a faint "save me." Her heart longed for someone to come and rescue her. At this moment, the tears that had filled Grace's eyes began to fall rapidly. Just a moment ago, she was full of confidence, feeling she could do anything. But in an instant, it was as if she had been kicked to the ground hard. It was just the mockery of a drunkard. If someone else had faced such unfair words, they might have fought back long ago. This was a trivial moment. Just then, there was a whistling sound of wind, followed by the thud of a large object hitting the ground. Grace heard a familiar voice say that old man was in the way. However, the voice also sounded unfamiliar, because the person she knew would never speak in such a tone. Then Benjamin's gaze turned to Grace, who was crouching in the corner. He said that he had been in a good mood today, but in the blink of an eye, it had become terrible. Benjamin walked over to Grace and placed his wide-brimmed hat on her head. Then he carefully tried to lift her head. Grace resisted. Benjamin repeatedly called "my lady" and begged Grace to look at him. He also asked if she had trouble walking and if he could carry her. Finally, this familiar voice put Grace at ease. Although she believed Benjamin might kill her in the future, hearing this loving voice at this moment, she still raised her head. When the tear-streaked Grace read a certain emotion on Benjamin's loving face, she almost stopped breathing. In that instant, she thought of a word to describe the previously indescribable feeling. Don't be afraid. She clearly saw disgust in Benjamin's eyes. The red light in the annex was on again. The reason was that Grace had fallen into a state of depression again. This was a common occurrence. Grace was usually gentle and kind, but sometimes she would fall into extreme depression. Although she did not show her depression obviously, it was clear from the surrounding atmosphere that she was in a deep state of depression. She could neither ask Benjamin what had happened nor inquire with his assistant, Abel Burton. At the masquerade festival, Benjamin, who was known for his gentleness, was silent but extremely angry. Grace knew he would not vent his emotions on the servants, but she still couldn't help but feel scared. Today, Grace, regardless of what others thought, found something to do. Grace decided to check the ledgers first. She called the annex butler and asked for the ledgers. The butler brought them to her without asking many questions. Grace opened the first page of the ledger and commented that the accounts were very well organized. Although she didn't quite understand the specific meaning of the numbers, she could see that the ledger was in order and nodded. Looking at the numbers in the ledger, Grace muttered to herself, saying she couldn't remember the details of the event at that time. Then another past event surfaced in her mind. She pressed her lips together tightly. While checking the details, Grace noticed something strange. She was puzzled, thinking they had been married for almost a year, but the ledger showed it had been almost 2 years. This reminded her of the day of the masquerade festival when she asked Benjamin if they had been married for almost a year. She wondered why Benjamin didn't correct her. She believed that after possessing Grace, her memories should have merged and been correct. At this moment, she realized she had made a serious mistake, and her face turned pale. She even imagined that it might have been better if she had proposed a divorce as a transmigrator to fulfill Benjamin's love. But she also worried that Benjamin would think she was crazy and send her to a hospital or convent. Grace went to the tea room with a map and a ledger in one hand. She saw that although she hadn't had tea here for a while, the tea set box was neatly organized. She marveled at the wide variety of teas, realizing that even if she drank tea all year, she wouldn't be able to finish them all. Some of the teas were past their expiration date and had to be thrown away. She cleared her blurry vision and checked the nearby catalog. It had an introduction to the Empire's specialty tea shops, but she was looking for tea plantation areas. Grace understood that she had accumulated a considerable amount of wealth over the past 2 years, but she did not intend to invest too much money in the orphanage, because after the business became profitable, it would be handed over to others. The smaller the scale, the easier it was to manage. At this time, Sally found Grace, who was looking for a reasonably priced place, and told her that the Lord had sent a gift and it would be best to go see it quickly. Grace held the catalog in her hand, her expression unenthusiastic. It wasn't that she disliked Benjamin, but she had seen the look of disgust on his face before. Regardless of whether that expression was directed at her, she felt uncomfortable. A voice in her head suddenly whispered that the expression was meant for her. Grace suppressed this voice and confirmed with Sally if it was a gift. After getting an affirmative answer, she quickly tried to dispel the stiff expression on her face. Sally noticed her strangeness, but pretended not to notice her hesitation, because she could feel that Grace didn't want to be found out. Sally said the gift was very beautiful. Grace remembered that Benjamin had sent a lot of food last time, and wondered if he had sent desserts again this time. Sally's description of beautiful made Grace blink. She got up and walked in the direction she was led. Arriving at the entrance of the annex, Grace saw it was filled with colorful flowers, as well as oils, herbs, and other things, emitting a pleasant and not pungent aroma, which made her feel good. She found that the flowers Benjamin sent were all small, and some she couldn't even name. These flowers were simple and plain, with sparse leaves, the type that wouldn't be planted in a nobleman's garden. However, she thought the colors were beautiful. Although she knew the flowers Benjamin gave to Aria were large and gorgeous, Grace did not dislike these small flowers. She also thought these flowers would be great for pressing. The servants asked Grace what to do with the cookies Benjamin had sent this time. Grace looked at the colorful cookie tin with a cute rabbit on it, tilted her head slightly, and took a bite. At first, she wanted to give the cookies to the servants. Then she changed her mind and suggested that there was an orphanage not far from here, and proposed giving the cookies to the children there. Grace picked up a box of herbal tea and called the butler, asking if there was any unused muslin in the warehouse, explaining that it didn't have to be a whole piece, just as wide as a book would do. She was going to use it to make something. The butler said he would go check. Hearing the mention of muslin, the servant's expressions initially darkened, thinking of a whole bolt of cloth. But while waiting for Grace to continue speaking, their expressions changed in anticipation of her next words. Grace hesitated for a moment. The butler politely widened his eyes, quietly waiting for her to speak again. Grace quietly asked the butler if she could use her personal funds freely. She also proposed that she wanted to go out for a while, and asked if she could explain the reason in detail if things didn't work out. The butler replied that it was entirely Grace's personal property, and she had the right to dispose of it as she pleased. When Grace went out, she was sure someone would follow her. A mysterious noble like her was rare, but a plain noble who was dug into without any guilt was even rarer. She remembered a plot in the original novel where Benjamin told Aria that he was embarrassed because reporters were constantly following his wife. Aria used her clever means to catch those reporters. Benjamin also expressed his gratitude to Aria, saying that even if he caught one reporter before, other reporters would still follow, which had always been embarrassing. In the orphanage, Grace showed Cleta the business idea she had come up with. She took out an item, and with the creaking of the orphanage kitchen floor, she made a Tata gesture. Cleta was puzzled by the item on display. Grace told her it was a tea bag. Cleta repeated the word tea bag. Grace confirmed it again. Cleta looked at the cloth bag filled with crushed herbal tea, her face full of confusion. Grace explained that it was made of muslin and that there might be a more suitable fabric, but for now, she was just using this temporarily. Cleta could see at a glance that the muslin Grace used was of high quality. As she examined the tea bag, Grace began to elaborate on her idea. Grace mentioned that the Empire had made progress in transportation, and travel had become more convenient with the help of portals. They even exported portals to other countries. So, with a permit, people could not only travel within the Empire, but also travel abroad. However, the process of obtaining a permit was very cumbersome. Grace decided to skip this unnecessary explanation. Facing Cleta, who was staring wide-eyed in front of her, Grace smiled and explained that if you want to drink tea, you naturally have to put in tea leaves. But this requires a lot of tools and creates a lot of dishes to wash, which is very time-consuming. Cleta agreed, saying that's why she didn't drink tea often. Although she was curious about coffee, she rarely had it because of its high price. Grace agreed with Cleta about the high price of coffee and mentioned that coffee hadn't been popular for long, and the process of brewing it was quite tedious. Grace said that using the method she demonstrated was very simple. You just need to soak the item in hot water for a while and then take it out. It's both simple and quick. Grace glanced at Cleta and saw that her expression showed no particularly negative signs. Cleta pointed out that there were problems, noting that raw material procurement, labor, and venue all needed to be resolved. Grace replied that these problems had already been solved because before proposing this to Cleta, she had naturally considered these aspects. She knew well that having only sympathy without a solution would be frustrating. She mentioned that when the annex staff sympathized with her, they at least showed some kindness. Grace also mentioned that they could use the orphanage as a venue and start selling from here. After all, this was a business to raise funds for the orphanage. Regardless of the product quality, there would always be people willing to buy to show off their kindness. She didn't think tea bags would immediately appeal to everyone. Regarding the employee issue, Grace proposed hiring the children's mothers to work here. As Grace said this, Cleta's face turned pale. Grace explained that some of the children here had mothers, such as single mothers who left their children at the orphanage because they couldn't take care of them. Cleta asked how she knew. Grace looked at the children playing outside the window, observing their clothes. She pointed out that although they were generally similar, some children's clothes were different, such as some being newer, having embroidery, or sturdy shoes. One could find out through careful observation. She asked if the children knew about their mother situations. Cleta nodded. Grace smiled and said that the children must want to see their mothers, because people need to see their families, especially loving families. Cleta praised her keen eye. Grace responded with thanks. At this moment, the water on the kitchen stove boiled. Cleta got up and poured the water into a cup with a missing handle. She put in the tea bag Grace had made. Grace said it was unreasonable for her to fund the orphanage children alone. Cleta accepted the suggestion, stating that they were short of funds at the beginning, and nodded in agreement. Grace further said that some of the children's biological mothers must be sending money from elsewhere. If not here, there would be no orphanage where they could see their children. Because in similar institutions, leaving a child at a temple, while not a burden, would mean they could never see each other again. Grace asked about the whereabouts of the orphanage's director. Cleta informed her that he had left because the funds were no longer sufficient, and she had been trying her best to raise funds since. Then Grace thought, given that the orphanage had few children but a large building, she proposed converting part of the space into a work area and the rest into employee dormitories. Cleta immediately understood the meaning of her proposal. Grace smiled brightly and agreed. Grace then mentioned that making black tea leaves was time-consuming, but the tea garden they knew of had a stock of already made black tea leaves. Cleta exclaimed that they were lucky. Grace explained that those tea leaves were of poor quality and did not meet the standards for sale, which was why they could be traded at a low price. It was a small tea garden on a remote island, not belonging to a small estate. Although the geographical location was good, Grace had thought the price would not be low, but she didn't expect to get it at a low price. Later, Cleta reported that the orphanage had a total of 13 children, 7 of whom had mothers. However, among these mothers, only 4 women accepted Cleta and Grace's proposal. After hearing Cleta's report, Grace was full of doubt, not understanding why only some of them accepted. Grace thought of a simple and quick way to find the orphanage director and force him to hand over the embezzled funds by buying the orphanage's land and giving the deed to Cleta. But she understood that she couldn't do this secretly on her own, and without her help, Cleta couldn't hold onto that land either. Once she went to the director for money, she would be. Benjamin found out. Grace was a little sad about this. Every time Benjamin showed deep affection, her heart would pound. But then he would suddenly become distant, which made her feel cold. In this situation, she would involuntarily think of Benjamin and become anxious. Sally saw Grace tossing and turning, hugging her pillow, and became worried too. Grace hugged the pillow tightly and suddenly sat up, saying she had made up her mind. At this moment, a determined expression, different from before, appeared on her face. This greatly surprised Sally. Sally looked at Grace anxiously and fearfully, asking what was wrong. Grace replied that she had to go and see the mothers who had refused the proposal. She asked Sally if there was a gift that was inexpensive, full of sincerity, and wouldn't make the recipient feel uncomfortable. But then, Grace said she would make the gift herself, mentioning that she had made pressed flower paper last time with the flowers the Lord had given her. Although Sally didn't understand why she would use materials from a gift from her husband to make a new gift and didn't know who the gift was for, she couldn't stop Grace. Sally had followed Grace for over a year, and at this moment, she felt that Grace was the most energetic she had ever seen her. Previously, Grace had been extremely lost, her tone unsteady, and her emotions highly volatile. Now, she was radiant and cheerful. This made Sally think of the saying, a rainbow after the storm. It's just that the beauty of this moment was not due to ordinary things. Sally felt uneasy in her heart. Catherine's days were exhausting. She worked until midnight every night, with almost no time to wash up and sleep. In the early morning, She had to get up early to go to work at the restaurant. In the morning, she prepared ingredients, and once work started, she washed dishes nonstop, too busy to eat properly. She could only hastily eat her already hardened homemade sandwich during a short break, and then continue working. Catherine carefully climbed the stairs and noticed a letter and a small package in the mailbox by her door. She was puzzled because she usually only received bills. Letters to her child's biological father only received a reply from someone else, saying he was no longer there. Seeing that the package's contents were related to the business proposal the orphanage teacher had made last time, Catherine sneered. She guessed the other party was probably a rich lady or a noblewoman, thinking that the kind and gullible Cleta might have been persuaded to join someone's hobby. She was about to tear up the letter without reading it, but the pleasant scent wafting from it stopped her. Catherine thought the letter might explain the specifics of the business and the benefits it could bring her, so she decided to read the contents and open the letter. However, when she read the first line of the letter, she couldn't help but read the entire letter word for word. After reading it, she couldn't help but cry. The letter didn't mention the business at all. It began by describing the weather, saying there were a few clouds in the sky, and some might think it was a cloudy day, but this way, even if the children played outside all day, there was no need to worry about sunburn. Then it mentioned the condition of the orphanage rooms. Some rooms were old, but they looked good after being cleaned. It also asked about Catherine's recent situation. Finally, it wished her all the best. The content of this letter seemed ordinary, but it made Catherine, who was rarely treated with kindness, feel sad. Catherine was puzzled. She thought to herself that the other person said they wanted to hire her, but why didn't they mention the business at all? She couldn't help but sigh at what a strange person this was. She choked back her sobs, trying not to let the sound pass through the thin walls, but tears still streamed down her cheeks. She also thought about the poor soundproofing of the house. She couldn't cry out loud. Her lease was up next month anyway, so she showed a faint smile. After Grace sent out a few more letters, everyone agreed to join. Although one person said they needed to finish this month's work before coming, Grace still considered it a success. She decided not to wait any longer and soon prepared for production. Grace went to the orphanage again. As the work progressed, she spent more time at the orphanage. Compared to the ducal mansion, she preferred the orphanage. Work made Grace happy. When everything was going smoothly, Grace felt she wouldn't be depressed. She felt she had found her reason for being. But the next moment, Grace saw Aria. Then she saw Benjamin. A few hours before Grace saw Benjamin and Aria, she met the children's mothers. These people had different personalities, but were all kind-hearted. Grace looked around their neatly organized bedroom and proudly said that first, they needed to negotiate a partnership with a fabric workshop. Cleta was full of worry upon hearing this, feeling that they themselves were not yet fully on track and that the amount of fabric needed might not be much. She questioned whether they should cooperate with a fabric workshop in a similar situation. Grace explained that she had investigated some fabric workshops. Besides the well-known ones, there were several small workshops. If they communicated well, the small workshops would agree to cooperate. She further explained that large workshops usually monopolized business with clothing stores. Although they also did some small business or odd jobs, there were shortcomings. They were unwilling to miss even small business. Grace planned to buy practice items or defective products, thinking this was more suitable since they were not making clothes. The quantity might be small at first, but they could cultivate regular customers who bought unsold products. This might be quite popular in small shops with low profits. She also mentioned that the water on the island was now hard to drink. In the latter half of the original novel, Aria discovered that even after the Lundell Canal purification project was completed, the water still had a strange taste, so she chose to leave. The reason was that the land in the western region was polluted. At this time, they heard the sound of a delivery truck arriving outside. This was the signal that the ordered supplies had arrived. Cleta and the other women were very surprised to see the huge delivery truck. Grace said this was not all. Even if they only cooperated with a few restaurants, they would soon be busy. They had to transport a large number of tea bags every day and also promote them in new restaurants. She believed that even if people were not familiar with tea bags at first, as long as they kept paying attention, there would eventually be an opportunity to buy. Moreover, people could help children by buying a cup of tea, which was a win-win situation. After that, Grace suggested going to the textile workshop at that moment, saying she planned to go alone and asking if anyone was willing to accompany her. She planned to establish a connection between the textile workshop and the orphanage for insurance. The companion Grace chose was Lily. Lily seemed to be good at calculations and not stingy, and clearly did not look down on people more than money. Grace thought she was suitable for building trust at the workshop. After Grace and Lily visited 3 small workshops, they decided to make a deal with the 4th and final one, a small and dilapidated fabric workshop. Lily looked skeptical, as if questioning whether this place was feasible. Grace, on the other hand, looked around the workshop, examined the muslin samples, and after carefully reviewing the contract, planned to take it back to study further with her colleagues. When leaving the shop, Lily, holding the muslin, said that this transaction was faster and easier than she had imagined. She had thought there would be more trouble. She felt that small shops usually had their own pride and dignity and might question their deal. Grace knew from the conversations of the orphanage mothers that this kind of situation was more common in large shops, so she did not deny Lily's words. Seeing that Grace didn't respond, Lily hesitated and then asked why she specifically chose to deal with this workshop. She also admitted that among the workshops they had visited, the second one looked the cleanest and had the best conditions. Grace agreed with Lily's statement and recalled her experience at the workshops. Every time she went to a workshop, she pretended to wander around, but was actually observing the surroundings and the quality of the fabrics the workshop produced and imported. Although she didn't know much about the criteria for high-quality fabrics, she could compare them with what she saw daily. The last workshop she visited imported ordinary quality fabrics, but self-produced fabrics were very exquisite. It was hard to imagine such craftsmanship coming from a small shop. Moreover, every time Grace went out, she wore a cloak and shawl made of latent leather. Ordinary people couldn't identify the maker of the fabric, but they could see that it was an expensive fabric that even top clothing stores would find difficult to acquire. Grace did not find the same level of talent and skill in the first 3 workshops. She only recognized the potential and true skill of the workshop she was preparing to sign with. However, Grace couldn't explain all this to Lily in detail. She just patted the muslin in her hand and said that the muslin produced by this workshop was fine, and that was exactly the kind of fabric they needed. So she chose this place. Although Lily said she understood, she still glanced at Grace with a hint of suspicion. Grace helplessly tilted her head to avoid her gaze, thinking that dealing with a small workshop now and building trust and friendship, and if they could expand the workshop scale, it would be even better. Grace was now thinking about supporting a workshop, seeing things gradually getting on track. She felt very satisfied. Then she witnessed this scene. Grace saw the man and woman in front of her. She couldn't help but let out a questioning "ah." She blurted out, "My lord." Although she knew Lily was right behind her, she had no intention of hiding her intention to call out to Benjamin. She saw Benjamin smiling affectionately at the beautiful woman beside him, Aria. Given his usual affectionate nature, such a gesture was not surprising. Grace was certain in her heart that Benjamin Felton liked Aria. At this moment, Aria was reflected in Grace's deep turquoise eyes. Aria Miller, as the heroine of The Saint's Wish, was deeply loved by this world. It was no exaggeration to say that she was adored by everyone. Her beauty was enough to move hearts. Grace knew very well that the description of Aria's appearance in the novel was by no means an exaggeration. In fact, those words could hardly fully capture her stunning beauty. Just then, Benjamin noticed Grace. His pupils contracted sharply as he cried out, "My lady." His expression was as if he had been caught red-handed, looking flustered. Seeing this, Grace hurriedly pulled her cloak down tightly to cover her face and said to Lily, "Let's leave quickly." Lily sensed the strange atmosphere between the two and immediately turned to follow Grace. Benjamin hurriedly chased after Grace, saying she was carrying a lot of things and he wanted to help her carry them. Grace replied that it wasn't necessary because he had his companion Aria with him. But Benjamin said that Aria was not that important. Hearing this, Grace stopped in her tracks and questioned him. "Do you think the only saint in the empire is not important?" Benjamin looked at Grace in surprise, at a loss for words. Grace continued, saying that no matter how long she had been confined to her room before, she still had that much common sense that "don't take me for a fool." Grace wondered inwardly why she was so angry. She clenched her fists tightly and glared at Benjamin, telling him to have fun with the beautiful saint. Then she suddenly turned and walked towards the orphanage. Benjamin failed to catch up with Grace. Lily did not ask Grace any particular questions. Her thoughtfulness made Grace very grateful. From the very beginning, everyone knew that Grace was a special existence in this orphanage. Grace began to make a template based on the tea bag she had originally made. At the same time, she heard the sound of children playing outside. After the sample was completed, people with good drawing skills began to make tea bag labels. They inserted some thin and flat objects between the labels to add weight. Grace asked everyone if they could help promote those restaurants. Everyone readily nodded in response to her question and said that Grace had already done a lot for everyone. They also thanked Grace and told her to go back and rest. Then everyone saw Grace off. Grace, who had been in high spirits before setting out, was now in low spirits. The servants all frowned upon seeing this. Grace said she wanted to be alone in her room and didn't want to eat today, claiming she had already eaten outside. After returning to her room, Grace buried her head in her pillow. Grace had to admit that she couldn't completely detach her emotions from her current situation. Grace said she had tried to contact 10 restaurants, and 3 of them had responded. It seemed Cleta was making good progress. Grace said she might not be able to participate in the tea bag business often anymore, but she wouldn't completely ignore it either. She would come when it was time to distribute the money. Cleta was a firm and kind person, so she wasn't worried. What she was most concerned about now was the divorce. Grace pulled a cord, and a servant came in. Grace asked if the Lord was busy. The servant replied that the master should be in the main building. After learning this, Grace said that if Benjamin wasn't busy, she wanted to talk to him. She felt there was no harm in proposing a divorce urgently. She thought that after regaining her memory, getting a divorce and managing her business might be the best option. After seeing Aria with her own eyes, comparing herself to her, and returning to her original state, Grace felt that compared to being depressed from the beginning, falling into depression again after feeling better was more like a death sentence. She felt like a shark that had forgotten how to swim. The garden was always full of flowers and charming scenery. Grace proposed to meet with Benjamin, and the reply was to have tea in the garden and that the refreshments would be ready soon. The ever-blooming flowers in the garden had an exciting charm. Being in a beautiful environment with a beautiful person could revive once-lost emotions and make a calm heart beat faster. However, seeing Benjamin in front of her, Grace's heart was only calm. The two sat silently at the table, and finally, Benjamin was the first to break the silence. He mentioned that the weather was very nice that day. Grace replied dryly that the weather was indeed nice. On the tea table covered with a white tablecloth, there was an exquisite teapot, teacups, and several kinds of snacks. Grace looked down at the hand resting on her lap and wondered if plump was the right word to describe it. She knew very well that even if she lost a lot of weight, she could never compare to the heroine Aria. From the beginning, their basic appearances were different. However, Grace still straightened her back. Grace believed that since he had a wife, he shouldn't be interested in other women. This couldn't be called charming at all. She remembered that she had liked Benjamin when she read the novel because she liked affectionate men. So she was shocked by Benjamin's behavior in the latter half of the novel. But in fact, she still had a soft spot for Benjamin in her heart. She felt that he was essentially affectionate. But in the end, he still fell in love with Aria. Grace couldn't help but wonder if it was the same in real life as it was in the novel. She didn't want her unrequited love to end in death. Looking at the smiling Benjamin, Grace said, "Let's get a divorce." As soon as these words were spoken, Benjamin froze, holding his teacup. Not only him, but all the surrounding servants also forgot to breathe in astonishment, looking at Grace. But after saying the word divorce, only Grace remained completely calm. In the clear tea, her reflection, far less beautiful than the heroine's, once again stated that she wanted a divorce, saying she would not say anything more and would not appear before Benjamin again. Grace had originally thought Benjamin would be happy about this and would immediately propose to draft the divorce papers. However, Benjamin's reaction was beyond her expectations. Benjamin called out, "My lady," again. Grace looked up and saw Benjamin's eyes full of tears. Benjamin asked what he had done wrong, if he had made a mistake while serving her. Tears streamed down his well-defined face. Benjamin told Grace that whatever she needed, he would do his best to fulfill it. He even said that if Grace wanted him to kneel, possible, he would do so, and if she didn't want to see his face, he would wear a mask for the rest of his life, begging her not to leave his side. Grace looked at Benjamin with a confused expression. Benjamin continued, saying he knew he had many shortcomings and had made many mistakes, so it was not a sudden decision for Grace, who had always been a kind lady, to propose a divorce. He continued to pour out his heart, saying that Grace had always been thoughtful and must have considered many aspects, and it was his own fault for not noticing the signs. Benjamin seemed to have no intention of getting up. As the head of the family and the Grand Duke of the country, he had not even thought of getting up from his seat. In order to keep his wife, who was known only for being ugly, he chose to kneel. Seeing this, Grace stood up and extended her hand to Benjamin, telling him to get up. Benjamin looked up and asked Grace if she would reconsider the divorce. Grace did not respond. Benjamin understood that this act would hardly change Grace's mind. If she would change her mind over this, she wouldn't have proposed a divorce in the first place. So he lowered his head and muttered to himself. If this would make Grace feel more comfortable, he would accept it, believing he must have done something wrong to cause Grace to make such a choice. Grace watched Benjamin stand up and close his eyes, thinking about the wrong he had mentioned. She believed that while Benjamin considered her his wife, even secretly admiring Aria was indeed wrong. But this marriage was unwilling for Benjamin in the first place. Despite this, he still expressed his love for her as much as possible, playing the role of an affectionate husband even if he didn't love her. The servants of the ducal mansion were also quite friendly to her, who hardly fulfilled her duties as the lady of the house. Based on these, Grace's heart wavered for a moment. After all, she still had feelings for Benjamin. After hesitating, Benjamin informed Grace that divorces between nobles were under the jurisdiction of the royal court, and his every move could have an impact on the empire. Grace nodded in agreement with his statement and also said that she should have learned more about the relevant situation before proposing a divorce. Benjamin, however, said that she didn't need to know these things. Grace replied that she was not yet divorced and was still the Duchess, so she should know. Benjamin was silent in response to Grace's quick and reasonable reply. In the imperial court office, the royal officials were busy. It was no exaggeration to say that it was their hard work that maintained the livable and peaceful state of the empire. Everyone saw one person with his legs crossed amidst a mountain of documents. Someone spoke to him, calling him Your Highness, the Prince. This person was exceptionally handsome, with well-defined and handsome features, black hair, and violet eyes like morning glories. For the past few years, he had been wandering around without a fixed abode, causing a lot of trouble wherever he went. This was widely known. However, since Miss Aria appeared, he seemed to have quieted down a lot. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, which was out of place in the palace. The person talking to Sylvester frowned at the sound. He saw Danica rushing over. He had wanted to call him Mr. Bruno, but he stuttered due to his haste. Sylvester reminded Danica that royal officials represent the royal family and should pay attention to their conduct. Danica directly informed Sylvester that he had brought a divorce petition. When Sylvester heard this, he initially thought it was no big deal. For matters like high-ranking nobles divorcing, he usually just set a suitable observation period. However, when Danica said that this divorce petition came from the Duke of Felton's family, Sylvester's face instantly turned deathly pale. A maid from the annex, accompanied by the butler, appeared with a silver tray, informing Grace that a letter had arrived from the palace, setting the observation period. She nodded silently and took the letter and a letter opener from the butler. She saw that the letter stated the divorce observation period was 8 months. Grace pondered what to do during the divorce observation period. Even if she was required to carry out activities with Benjamin as a married couple, she couldn't imagine what specific activities there would be. At this moment, the butler, seeing Grace thinking about matters between a husband and wife, called out to her. Grace looked at the butler with a calm expression and asked if there were any other letters. The butler said that was not the case, but rather asked if she would be willing to have dinner with the Lord if it was convenient. Grace hesitated at the word dinner. On second thought, she rarely dined with Benjamin. This was because she usually stayed in the annex or the garden of the ducal mansion, so she agreed to the butler's request. Then Grace asked if having dinner together was part of the marital activities during the observation period. The butler gave an affirmative answer and informed her that the imperial court's legal department would later inquire with the servants about the situation. Hearing this, Grace lamented that the empire's royal officials were very thorough. These are things that were difficult for a non-high-ranking noble to understand and experience. She then asked if she had to stay in the main building. The butler replied that it was fine, as it had always been this way. After thinking for a moment, Grace looked up and asked the butler if she could go out, promising to be back before dinner. The butler said that if she wanted to go out, she could, but the knights would always be nearby. Grace said she didn't mind, and also asked the butler if he had already reported to the Lord. The butler said that the lady's outing had been recorded, but only the location and actions were recorded, and it would not be reported. Grace nodded in approval of the butler's truthful reply, understanding that this information would be useful if something happened to her. When she was depressed because of Benjamin's matter, she had hastily entrusted the affairs to Cleta. It should have been a gradual handover, so she felt guilty. However, she felt that everyone should be able to do a good job. While putting on her cloak, Grace remembered the flowers she had pressed last time. Thinking that if the flowers were pressed for too long, they would stick to the paper, she decided to go to the study to take them out. Seeing the window open, she guessed that someone had opened it for cleaning and ventilation. She thought she should deal with it quickly so as not to worry the cleaning maid. A gust of wind blew, and Grace accidentally dropped the pressed flower she was holding. The flowers floated far away and then out the window. Some of the pressed flowers also stuck to Grace. The wind blew again, and the flowers that had not yet been picked up swayed gently. Just then, a strange object caught her attention. Grace saw, near the low flower bed in front of the annex, a small object that was hard to describe in words. To be precise, she didn't see clearly what it was. She just felt that there was something there that, although invisible, made her uncomfortable. After searching for a while, Grace finally found the small and exquisite object. It was a black pebble that exuded an ominous aura. Grace turned the pebble over with her thumb and forefinger, her face full of confusion, not understanding why there was such a stone here. Just then, Grace saw a magnificent carriage, different from the one Benjamin usually rode in, appear. She saw the butler of the main house welcoming a young man who got out of the carriage, although she had never seen this person before. But Grace immediately recognized him as the male lead of the original story, Sylvester, the Cursed Prince. She was surprised in her heart and began to wonder why he had come. At the same time, she recalled the relationship between Sylvester and Benjamin in the original story. At this moment, Sally walked towards Grace. Sally mentioned that Amanda had seen Grace in the study earlier and asked what she was doing here. Grace decided to first ask Sally about the pebble in her hand, wanting to know where this stone came from. She also said that she found it very strange. Sally saw the pebble Grace showed her, tilted her head, and asked Grace if she wanted to change it to a brighter colored one, because bright colored stones were currently in fashion. Grace said that wasn't the problem. Just as she was about to mention her strange feeling about this pebble, the pebble in her hand suddenly cracked and exploded. Sally was even more shocked than the injured Grace, screaming in panic and calling for the attending physician. Grace looked at the attending physician and thought he was very calm. After an examination, the doctor said that Grace's injuries were not serious. Grace thanked the doctor. The doctor replied that it was his honor to be able to help Grace, who rarely saw a doctor. Grace blinked after hearing this, thinking that the servants in the annex might have told the doctor that she was frail, so she didn't say anything, just nodded. After all, Grace was originally set up as a character who often played the role of a patient. If she could see a doctor often when she was sick, she wouldn't always be treated as a patient. Grace said she saw Prince Chu's carriage. The doctor then hinted to him that he might need to stay for dinner. Grace immediately understood the doctor's meaning, nodded, picked up her cloak, and stood up. She stated that her right hand was injured, making it difficult to follow formal dining etiquette and inconvenient to dine with non-family members. The doctor said this was also his medical advice. Grace placed the cloak aside, judging in her heart that tonight's appointment would naturally be canceled. Moreover, their conversation here would inevitably reach Benjamin's ears. She asked if she could leave. The response was that leaving was a way of parting from a certain perspective. After agreeing with this statement, she left the office, followed by the maids from the annex. At that moment, a young man's loud voice called out, "Ayo, brother." Upon hearing this, Grace's eyes widened and she straightened her posture. The maids behind her also straightened their bodies. Immediately after, they heard the man shout, "Forget it. My brother never listens to me." Looking toward the sound, they saw Sylvester in the distance, looking annoyed, shouting as he walked quickly. Grace hurriedly tried to put on her cloak, but Sylvester spotted her first. Grace stood still, looking at Sylvester, thinking that even if he was a notorious playboy, the prince had attended the wedding to Benjamin arranged by the emperor. she should greet him. But just as Grace was about to make a greeting gesture, Sylvester merely gave a rough nod, motioning for her to pass directly. Suddenly, she saw the boots below. Before hearing a sound, she recognized Benjamin by his boots. Grace greeted Benjamin. Benjamin looked at her in surprise, asking why she was here and about the condition of her right hand. Grace nonchalantly stated that there was a small accident. Hearing this, Benjamin's expression became even more complicated, saying that she seemed to be seriously injured. Grace responded that it wasn't that serious, but she couldn't have dinner with him because she heard he had a guest. Benjamin mentioned Prince Chu, but before he could finish his sentence, he raised his right hand and reached toward Grace's face. Grace was startled and dodged to the left. Only then did she realize that Benjamin's right hand was pushing Sylvester's face away. Benjamin then told Sylvester not to be rude to his wife, adding that even if she weren't his wife, confronting someone like that was inappropriate. This reminded Grace that Sylvester had been the same when he first met Aria. Perhaps that was why Aria had hit him. Realizing this was a habit of Sylvester's, Benjamin told Sylvester to go back inside, saying he would be back soon. After pushing Sylvester back into the room, he quickly returned to Grace's side. Grace thought that Benjamin didn't really need to come back. At this moment, Benjamin's face looked even worse than before. He asked Grace if she was all right. Grace nodded, said she was fine, and raised her right hand. Benjamin's question was not about her hand, so he looked a little disappointed and didn't press the matter further. Benjamin suggested that if Grace was leaving, he would walk her to the back door. He then took Grace's cloak and carefully draped it over her, saying it was a Leighton-made cloak and that the weather had been cold lately, so she should take care. Grace thought it was a bit ridiculous that Benjamin said it was a Leighton-made cloak, but still worried about the weather, but she couldn't be bothered to argue. Usually, when escorting someone, one would offer an arm or a hand, but Benjamin just walked side by side with Grace, their steps in sync. On the way, Benjamin explained to Grace that when he and Prince Chu were young, he had briefly served as Prince Chu's playmate, so they occasionally met privately and were invited to gatherings. Upon reaching their destination, Cleta put down the steep tea bags and greeted Grace, calling her Mrs. Linden. Seeing all the women greet her in the same way, Grace felt relieved. She took a deep breath, thinking that maybe some of her previous feelings were just her imagination. She then nodded in response to Cleta's greeting. Cleta said that it always felt like something was missing when Grace was not around. Grace then asked if the house had been doing well in her absence. She checked on what everyone was currently doing and found that they had been steadily progressing with the restaurant matters she had arranged in advance, along with long-term contracts, earning contract fees, and gradually moving toward commercialization for individuals. Although everything was progressing smoothly, Cleta sighed and lamented her own shortcomings, saying the work was going well, but she hadn't been to the tea plantation yet. She had wanted to take the train, but it took too long. Even with the profits from the portal tea bags, she couldn't afford the cost of going to the tea plantation. Grace, however, said it was best not to use the portal. Grace explained that it wasn't that she didn't want to spend money for everyone, but there were rumors that the portal's power supply was currently unstable. The portal disaster was the incident where the westward portal malfunctioned, causing casualties. Because the portal connects different dimensions through a connecting passage, even though all the victims were rescued, the mental trauma left everyone deeply shaken. Because of this disaster, Alia ultimately chose to travel by carriage. Alia would stay at the tea plantation, the core of Grace's business, and pray. Grace knew that if the portal malfunctioned, the passage would close and reconnecting would take a long time, during which people would be trapped in another dimension. Although, fortunately, everyone survived and was rescued, they all went mad from the experience of being trapped. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but tighten her lips, inwardly wondering why she couldn't remember this terrible disaster, disappointed in her own memory. She couldn't help but sigh. She could clearly remember other things, but she had somehow missed this one major event. Grace told everyone that she thought the work was progressing well and that she was preparing to go back. At the same time, she asked if there were any suspicious people nearby. After getting a negative reply, she suggested hiring some guards once the situation stabilized, since it was all women and children here. After everyone nodded in agreement, Grace decided to go to the portal management office first. Although she didn't expect to get any useful information from it, it was better to go than not to go. Considering it would be fine to go back later tonight, everyone secretly hoped she wouldn't run into Sylvester. After all, their personalities were vastly different. Sylvester's attitude towards his own people and others was very different. On the way, Grace thought about how Benjamin had once been criticized for his connection to the portal. In reality, Benjamin had no direct relationship with the invention or research of the portal. He only invested in it by providing high-quality magic stones. But among those associated with the portal, he was the most famous. As a nobleman known for his politics and supported by commoners and minor nobles, reporters seized the opportunity to criticize him. It was because of this that Benjamin confided his pain to Aria and received comfort. On second thought, it wasn't particularly surprising that he fell in love with Aria. After all, he had already been attracted to her before this. Grace wondered without thinking. If she had solved the portal problem, would Benjamin not have fallen so deeply in love with Aria? She remembered the series of stories triggered by fixing the portal malfunction, revolving around Benjamin, Alia, and Sylvester, which then led to the plot about the Western region. And she had forgotten such a major thing. However, Grace understood that even if Benjamin hadn't received Alia's comfort, he would still have fallen in love with her, because he already had feelings for Alia. Soon, the carriage arrived in front of the portal management office. Grace paid the fare, got out, and found the entrance crowded with people. She immediately felt a sense of suffocation. She had always hated crowded places, just like in her previous life. She held her breath and walked into the office, hearing the bustling sounds of people inside. She began to look around. Grace didn't know much about magic and portals, but before the accident, she could often feel a strange airflow around her. She felt that the sudden accident was not a coincidence, but more like a terrorist attack. Grace was glad the accident hadn't happened yet, but she knew her abilities were limited and she had no way of knowing the cause of the accident. There was only one thing to do now: get Benjamin to thoroughly check the portal's condition to prevent the portal disaster from happening. To alleviate the nausea from magic-induced motion sickness, Grace leaned against a pillar in a corner. Suddenly, a scene from her childhood flashed into her mind. In Viscount Linden's territory, Viscount Linden had a beautiful daughter, a robust son, and an ordinary daughter, Grace. Linden Grace inherited her carrot-colored hair and freckles from her maternal grandmother. In the current Viscount's family, no one else had this hair color. Once, when Grace was looking for a place to read alone, the children who used to bully her in groups appeared. The children mocked her, saying she had something smeared on her nose and cheeks, that she was dirty. They also mentioned that her other siblings were all clean, while only she was like this. Grace, who had always been gentle and meek, had tears welling up in her eyes. In the distance was her brother, Mr. Gilbert, but he had no intention of helping her, because he didn't want to be mocked too. Grace cried out for her brother, but Gilbert turned his head and walked away in another direction. Seeing this, everyone laughed at Grace. Without her sister nearby, Grace suddenly felt she had no one to rely on. Grace blinked, waking up from a nightmare induced by a long fever. She was covered in sweat, unable to tell if the heat was from the fever or the nightmare. She thought about the childhood dream, then corrected herself, realizing it was the original Grace's dream. Grace recalled the many instances of bullying she suffered as a child. The adults, on the grounds that it was a matter between children, ignored her. Over time, she saw annoyance in the adults' eyes and gave up asking for help. She never expected that just a walk through the crowd at the portal management office would weaken her body so much. After nearly fainting in the office, Grace forced herself to stay conscious until she saw Benjamin. Remembering this, Grace's throat felt dry. She struggled to lift her heavy body, but a wave of dizziness hit her. Grace couldn't help but wonder if her body was really so vulnerable to crowds. She thought of the festival night. Although she had felt a little unwell then, it was still bearable. She thought that if she was this weak, she might not be able to go out in the future. Previously, because of a major accident, as long as she had secret guards following her covertly, she could go out. She had no other servants with her. Perhaps it was because of these guards, but now she might have to be accompanied by other servants, or even be forbidden from going out. With this thought, Grace began to regret her rash and impulsive decision this time. Grace's mind was buzzing, making it difficult to fall asleep. Whenever she was in pain or sick and woke up, it was hard for her to sleep well again. This was a common situation for her. Grace stared blankly at a small bathroom by the bed. At this moment, some voices appeared in her mind, whispering negative and pessimistic things to her like "you're so stupid" and "you're only realizing it now." Just then, there was a light tapping sound on the window. Grace almost subconsciously looked up, thinking of someone. It was pitch black outside the window, a gentle breeze was blowing, and the leaves were rustling. Her thoughts became feverish. "It feels so hot. but then she realized it was the sound of the wind blowing branches against the window. Realizing who she had been expecting, she raised the corners of her mouth in embarrassment. She stared at the pitch-black window in front of her, the curtains not even drawn. This window, shrouded in the night, looked incredibly solid. Grace felt that it was refreshingly quiet at this moment, and she was high up. Thinking of this, she gently closed her eyes. Just then, she heard Benjamin's urgent call of Madam. Grace was suddenly brought back to reality, wondering if she had fallen asleep standing here. Surprised, she looked down in the direction of the voice, towards Benjamin. Seeing him still in his work clothes, as if he had just returned from outside, she began to think about what to say to him. Grace pondered how to start a conversation with Benjamin. Thoughts of greeting him, asking if he was busy or hospitalized, or saying good night flashed through her mind. However, while her thoughts were slow, her mouth moved decisively, expressing her apology to Benjamin, saying she had caused him trouble, and emphasizing that she didn't mean to faint. In her heart, she felt she just wanted to complain a little about her weakness. If she had known it would be this uncomfortable, she wouldn't have tried. But she couldn't help but wonder if she would really give up, even if that was the only way. Thinking this, she pressed her lips together. Benjamin looked at Grace with a complicated expression and replied that it was no trouble. But Grace believed that she had, in fact, caused Benjamin a lot of trouble. She mentioned that everyone was very considerate of her. She was allowed to go out just by saying she wanted to, and she didn't even have to do housework. Benjamin gripped the windowsill, looking at Grace leaning against it, and started talking about the tea bags Grace made. He said these tea bags were made for the orphanage, and they had decided to purchase them regularly and send them as support supplies to the northern region. Grace was confused by this. Benjamin further explained that although the northern region was used to dealing with monsters, it was still dangerous. Previously, they sent luxury goods to boost morale, but drinking tea was inconvenient. Thanks to Grace's tea bags, life there became more pleasant. Grace, however, felt it was a simple matter that anyone could have thought of. Benjamin emphasized that Grace was the first to come up with the idea and said that many things follow simple principles. Then, he praised Grace for doing great things outside, and that no one would dare to stop her. However, situations like today should be avoided. Grace understood that Benjamin was trying to cheer her up. She thought that if they supplied goods specifically to the northern region, even without huge profits, they could still make a considerable income. The orphanage's life would also be more prosperous. Thinking of this, the corners of her mouth turned up slightly. Grace asked Benjamin where he had been. Benjamin replied with a hint of teasing that he had just returned from the portal management office. He then added that his work had piled up not because of Grace, but because he had mentioned since last time that the portal management office needed expansion, and the portal maintenance workers and magic tool artisans have been going back and forth on inspections. After scratching his neck for a moment, Benjamin lowered his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then brought up a topic with Grace that she might not want to discuss: the Saintess. Grace was puzzled upon hearing this. Benjamin politely asked for her opinion, asking if they could talk about the Saintess. Grace swallowed dryly, pursed her lips, and said to treat it as a conversation between friends. Benjamin, however, said that the two of them couldn't be considered friends yet. He explained that friends are a relationship where you can invite someone to your home without any reservations, regardless of status. As he explained further, he observed Grace's condition. Seeing that Grace's face was still flushed from the fever and her eyes were bright even in the dark, he suggested they talk after she recovered. But Grace said she wanted to hear it. Benjamin then mentioned that the wind was cool and that Grace standing in the wind would worsen her condition. His words, though out of concern, might also cause Grace to misunderstand. After thinking for a moment, Grace asked Benjamin if he would be willing to come inside to talk in detail. Benjamin responded extremely quickly, first asking if she really didn't mind him coming in. After not getting an answer, he confirmed again. Grace slowly closed the window and slumped into a chair, feeling dizzy. She guessed it might be from being in the wind for too long or talking too much. However, she clearly felt that she was not as depressed as when she was lying in bed just now. At this moment, Grace realized she couldn't be too emotional, but the sudden wave of melancholy and self-mockery left her at a loss. In this sudden calm, she felt uneasy inside, yet couldn't pinpoint the reason for the disappearance of her depression and anxiety. Grace turned her head to look at the mirror. Without looking closely, she knew she looked a mess in the mirror. Before, she was in the dark, but now, inside, Benjamin would surely turn on the light when he came in. The light would be much brighter than the moonlight. Grace was full of confusion, muttering to herself, not knowing what to do. Just then, Benjamin's voice calling for Grace came from outside the door. After a moment of silence, the knock on the door sounded again. Benjamin asked from outside if she was asleep, adding that if she was asleep and couldn't answer, he would leave first. Grace hurriedly spoke up to keep him, saying she wasn't asleep, but had just realized how terrible her condition was. Grace felt very embarrassed saying this to Benjamin, feeling like a child throwing a tantrum. Benjamin then asked if he should leave for today. Grace quickly said no. Benjamin walked in and smiled at Grace, asking why she was standing instead of lying down. Grace replied that she couldn't lie down when a guest was here. Benjamin reminded her that they were still a married couple. Benjamin looked at Grace's empty bed and gave a wistful smile. Then, with a familiar motion, he straightened the bed sheets and gestured for Grace to get into bed. Grace hesitated for a moment, but still lay down on the bed. Benjamin covered her with a blanket. Benjamin explained to Grace that friendship is just a word, meaning that people can meet and get along regardless of family background or each other's status. Grace was puzzled by this and made a sound of Benjamin then explained that this was what they were talking about through the window earlier. Benjamin then said that in this sense, it was a pity that he and the saintess were not yet friends. If they were, he would definitely introduce the saintess to Grace. Hearing this, Grace asked if he really just wanted to be friends with the saintess. Benjamin talked about an experience when he was injured in an accident as a child and miraculously recovered. The former Duke and Duchess became devout believers because of this. Grace lay in bed, her body as heavy as waterlogged cotton, gradually feeling drowsy. Benjamin clasped his hands, anxiously thinking of a suitable topic, when he noticed a half-open drawer. He saw the pile of unused medicine packets that Grace had stacked, but he pretended not to see them. After Grace fell asleep, he tiptoed out of the room. The next day, Grace asked Benjamin if she would still be allowed to go out alone. Benjamin gave an affirmative answer, but also pointed out that this time was very dangerous. The condition Benjamin proposed was for Grace not to go too far, because there were no guards on the carriage, and if she went too far and got lost, she might encounter danger. Then Benjamin mentioned that after Grace fainted, he received reports on all the places she had been so far. He wanted to see them for himself and asked if he could go with Grace next time. Grace was puzzled by this. After all, the place mentioned was just the orphanage. She thought, isn't this a place Benjamin has already been to? Benjamin explained that he knew Grace often went to the orphanage. He just wanted to go again. He told Grace not to worry about his identity being exposed because he had an item that could hide his identity, even though the item looked old. Grace noticed that Benjamin was constantly fiddling with the brooch on his chest. Grace asked him why he kept doing that. Benjamin explained that it was because the brooch was too old and the pin didn't work well. Then, with Benjamin's permission, Grace picked up the brooch to examine it closely and found that this brooch looked even older than the one on her cloak. After thinking for a moment, Grace untied the decorative ribbon from her hair and used it to fasten the brooch to Benjamin's tie, asking if that was okay or if it should be tied tighter. While Grace was tying the ribbon, Benjamin, who had been tense, held the ribbon, not connecting the brooch and the tie, as if he were holding the most precious treasure in the world. He even said he would never untie it. Grace said that Benjamin should take it off when he changes clothes at home. But Benjamin insisted there must be a way to take it off without untying the knot. With positive thoughts, Grace arrived at the orphanage. After opening the door, the scene before her made it impossible for her to remain optimistic. Dunn saw Grace and called out in a panic, "Mrs. Linden." Grace asked what had happened. Dunn said it felt like the orphanage had been robbed. Grace saw that the inside of the workshop was in chaos. The muslin used as raw material was scattered on the floor, and the bags for tea leaves were also torn. People were busy sorting out which items could still be used immediately, and which ones could no longer be used. Faced with this sudden turn of events, Grace felt a pain in her stomach. She clutched her stomach and looked around at the mess, wondering if someone had come to steal money. She thought that the orphanage looked dilapidated. If it was just for money, this was not a suitable place. Besides, although Benjamin mentioned using the tea bags as military supplies, the contract negotiations hadn't even begun. There shouldn't be any rumors that there was a lot of money here. Benjamin saw Grace looking around with a grim face and asked Cleta if they had noticed any suspicious people nearby recently. Cleta was puzzled by the question about suspicious people. Benjamin introduced himself as Grace Linden's husband, then scanned the chaotic scene in the workshop. He pointed out that although it was messy, there were no signs of forced entry. He speculated that the intruder either knew how to get in or had investigated beforehand. Benjamin tried to open several windows in the workshop and found that they were all locked tight and could not be opened. Cleta responded to Benjamin's question, asking her colleagues if they had seen any suspicious people. The colleagues all shook their heads nervously. Grace walked over to Benjamin, who was inspecting the situation inside, and asked if he had found anything suspicious. Benjamin said that compared to Grace, he didn't know much about the relationships between the people in the orphanage and could only guess. Then Benjamin narrowed his eyes, lowered his head, and said softly to Grace that her condition didn't seem right at the moment and suggested she rest a bit. Hearing this, Grace wondered how Benjamin knew and turned her gaze to the window. She saw a blurry reflection. Although it wasn't clear, she felt her face didn't seem particularly pale. Seeing Grace's condition, Benjamin thought she needed to sit outside and get some fresh air. He told her he would check the situation separately. Then, with a brilliant smile, he guided Grace outside. Grace was almost pushed out. At this time, the children in the orphanage garden smiled and greeted Grace. Benjamin watched Grace being happily surrounded by the small children, then turned his head to look at Cleta. He asked if she was Cleta Dunn. Cleta confirmed her identity and asked what she should call Benjamin. Benjamin said she could call him whatever she felt comfortable with. He also said he was going to look around inside and asked if they had checked the safe. Cleta found it strange, because if the robbery was for money, they should have robbed the safe. But there was no indication that it was related to money. She guessed maybe the robber couldn't find the safe. Benjamin asked Cleta if she knew the location of the safe. Cleta replied that they used the bottom drawer of the bedroom wardrobe as a safe. After hearing this, Benjamin suggested she change the location next time, just in case. The children saw Grace, and one of them asked why she hadn't come often recently. Grace asked in return if it was better for her to come often. The child said they hoped she would come often. Then the children eagerly grabbed Grace's hand with their small hands. The children gathered to play building sandcastles. A child pointed to a place where the grass was lush and gave it to Grace, saying it was the best spot. Grace sat in the spot the children generously gave her, smiled, and kindly asked them if they had been playing building sandcastles like this recently. The children answered yes. As Grace asked, she sensed a hint of reluctance in the children's answers. She asked further if something was wrong. The children looked at each other, tightly closing their mouths, all observing each other's reactions, clearly hiding something. A child asked if Grace would think they were lying if they told her. Grace replied that she probably wouldn't. Only then did the child reveal to Grace that a strange man had come and asked about Grace. Hearing this, Grace blinked, unable to hide her surprise. The child continued, saying that everyone pretended not to know anything. The man came from time to time, but they all pretended not to know Grace. However, the man started asking the older children about it. He also said that if they told the adults in the orphanage about him, everyone would be split up and separated. Now Grace first went back outside and walked towards where Benjamin was. Grace softly called out Benny. Benjamin heard Grace's voice and immediately turned to look at her, as if afraid to miss anything. Grace then said that she had a problem to solve, and it seemed dangerous to handle it alone. Benjamin nodded, saying that since it wasn't appropriate for the children to hear their conversation, they should go back and talk. Cleta said she would try her best to handle these things and told Grace to go ahead. On the table this day was not tea or coffee, but herbal tea. Next to it were a few pieces of juicy fruit as snacks. Although Grace wanted coffee, Benjamin, who knew her preferences well, still insisted on preparing herbal tea. Grace revealed to Benjamin that after thinking, she had come to an important conclusion. She must temporarily withdraw from her work at the orphanage for now. Benjamin was surprised by this, asking why, since she had enjoyed going to the orphanage so much before. Grace explained that they couldn't just catch the culprit this time and ensure that similar incidents wouldn't happen again. Besides, they were in a trial period for their divorce. Benjamin nodded silently in agreement. He understood that even though it was currently just someone trying to investigate the mysterious Duchess, if their consideration of divorce became known, it could trigger a lot of speculation and inaccurate reports. Benjamin rubbed his temples and nodded, saying he had always been curious about this matter and now he understood. He speculated it might be the orphanage director. Grace, hearing the word director, immediately thought of the director who ran off with the money. Grace and Benjamin discussed the motive behind the orphanage incident. Someone speculated that the reporter might have already found out the Duchess's whereabouts and managed to find a way into the orphanage. According to Cleta Dunn, she put the money in the drawer of her bedroom dresser. This indicates that she didn't use this place to store money before. The money wasn't stolen because Cleta didn't use the original safe. Grace asked if the reporter would lay low for a while now, that they had called security and strengthened security. Benjamin affirmed this. He pointed out that reporters are very sensitive to this kind of thing. If they release the news now, the reporter will run away, and they don't even know what the reporter looks like. Grace recalled the child calling the man uncle and muttered softly, lost in thought. She rubbed her temples, her eyes turning downwards, and voiced the idea of whether she should go out alone at night. Hearing this, Benjamin looked horrified and incredulous, as if he had heard something terrible and absurd. He firmly replied that she should not do that, and emphasized again, absolutely not. Benjamin said that it had been less than a month since Grace fainted, and she wanted to do this kind of thing again. Even if she had never fainted, she shouldn't do it. His tone was firm, leaving Grace no room to interject. Since Benjamin had never interrupted Grace so firmly before, Grace broke out in a nervous sweat and tried to explain her plan, saying that if Benjamin just listened to her, he would understand. Benjamin was skeptical and raised his eyebrows. When he heard Grace emphasize again that she would not be in danger, Benjamin's expression instantly softened. He folded his hands neatly, ready to listen to Grace's plan. Late at night, Tom Perkin, holding a recording device, muttered to himself while feeling a headache. He thought, is this another one of Grace Felton's sudden whims? Grace Felton, the Duchess Felton, was a rather peculiar person. Although there were many rumors about Grace, there was very little concrete information. Even her appearance was unknown to anyone. Tom had even investigated the territory managed by Viscount Linden, but still couldn't find much information about her. He only knew that her childhood seemed a bit unhappy. Just then, Tom saw a figure in a navy blue cloak. The figure first looked around, then hurriedly ran out. Tom was puzzled, wondering to himself what was going on. He quickly stood up from his hiding place and began to follow, maintaining a certain distance. Tom couldn't help but ask himself, is there really no one? He then put the binoculars in his pocket, took out a small recording device, and slowly approached the woman, preparing to start recording. He was full of expectation, praying to be able to see the Duchess's face, because he desperately needed money. And to earn money, he had to see the Duchess's true face. The woman never showed her face, limping into a small alley. The experienced Tom recognized at a glance that this direction led to the black market. Just as Tom turned into the alley, a sharp sword was pressed against his throat. Someone called him Suspect Tom. As Tom was shocked, he saw the cloak with the green brooch fall to the ground, revealing a woman with reddish-brown hair and a strong, decisive appearance. The woman pointed her sword at Tom and stared at him coldly. Tom asked in terror who she was. The woman replied that she was Rosalia Wantellen, the vice-captain of the Second Knight Order of the Duchy of Felton, here to arrest him on the charge of threatening the Duchess of Felton. Rosalia Wantellen reported to Grace that, as the vice-captain of the Second Knight Order, she had successfully completed her mission. Grace praised her for a job well done. Rosalia knelt on one knee and returned the cloak to Grace, her demeanor exceptionally formal. Grace thought this reflected the sense of honor a knight should have. Rosalia said that she had accidentally dropped Grace's cloak on the ground and apologized for it. Grace took the cloak, thinking about how to phrase her words more appropriately. She replied that it was just a cloak, nothing to make a fuss about. Rosalia mentioned that His Highness had personally prepared it for Grace. Grace, however, said it was just a piece of clothing. If it got dirty, it could be washed. Besides, Rosalia had completed her mission and returned safely, so there was no need to worry about it. Rosalia then said she had something else to give Grace and handed her an old box, explaining that these were the belongings of the reporter, Tom Perkin, who was imprisoned in the ducal underground dungeon. She hadn't carefully checked the contents, but she could confirm there were no dangerous items like magic bombs. Grace expressed her thanks to Rosalia. Grace took the bag from Rosalia's hand, wondering inwardly why she gave it to her instead of Benjamin. Rosalia explained that it was the madam's order, so it was proper to report to the madam. Hearing this, Grace was a little surprised. Rosalia quickly stood up and told Grace that she knew this was a breach of etiquette and would take her leave. She then left the room. Grace stared blankly in the direction Rosalia had left, muttering to herself, "Wow, Rosalia Wantellin is so cool, so impressive." Tom Perkin was once quite clever, and perhaps he once had a sense of justice. But his family was poor, and his sense of justice was very fragile compared to the many things he had to protect. He wished everyone in the world could walk the right path, but he himself could not. Sitting on the cold prison floor, Tom contemplated his fate. Normally, people would expect to stand trial, but he knew he had no chance of such a conventional and perfect ending. At that moment, Tom heard footsteps approaching from a distance. He realized these were not the footsteps of a knight or a maid. Judging from the sound of a skirt brushing against the floor, it should be a woman. Since Tom didn't know anyone in the Duke of Felton's territory, he couldn't make any deductions. Finally, when he saw the person standing in front of him, Tom's eyes widened. It was Grace, holding a candlestick, looking down at him, sitting alone in the prison. Grace came to the underground prison alone, without any guards. Seeing this, Tom looked at her with suspicious eyes. Grace asked Tom if he wanted to write a report about her. Tom asked in return if she was the Duchess of Felton. Grace gave an affirmative answer. Grace read Tom's gaze and, from across the iron bars, looked down and explained to him that her knights were waiting outside. If Tom dared to make a move, she would call for help, so he should remember that. Tom sized up Grace, doubtful whether she was really the Duchess of Felton. He felt that the rumors about the Duchess of Felton were too exaggerated. The rumors described the Duchess as incompetent, lacking charm, and obese. But the Grace before him was ordinary-looking, slightly plump, with nothing special about her. Grace held a high position, but never participated in social gatherings. Tom couldn't help but wonder how these rumors had spread. He even suspected, could the Duchess have sent someone else to impersonate her? As if to interrupt Tom's suspicion, Grace spoke up, telling him she had seen all the materials he had gathered while investigating her, and praised him for his hard work. Tom asked Grace if she had come to interrogate him about his crimes. Grace nodded without hesitation, saying that could be said, and asked Tom how he planned to pay for his crimes. Hearing this, Tom's face fell, as if he had anticipated his grim fate. Grace explained to Tom that His Majesty would most likely send him to be judged. He should pay the price for his crimes. But if this matter became linked to politics, the problem would escalate. The punishment he would receive would far exceed his actual crime. Grace and Benjamin were in the process of getting a divorce at the time, but this matter had not yet been made public. Tom asked if he would be sentenced to death. Grace replied that it was not so, pointing out that a death sentence might sway public opinion, since no one had actually been substantially harmed. If there was any impact, it only involved the Duchess herself. After speaking, Grace lowered her head and then said she would give Tom a chance. Tom was puzzled by a chance. Grace said she had looked through the things in his bag and found that besides investigating her, he seemed quite capable. She also mentioned that he had a family to protect. Tom questioned if Grace was threatening him. Grace explained that if he took this chance, he would at least not be sentenced to life imprisonment in court. She thought that if there were no information brokers in this world, then she would create someone who could provide her with the information she needed. Moreover, Grace had easily discerned his needs through Tom's belongings. She believed that Tom Perkin might have given up his ideals for his family, but he was smart. As long as he was given a proper reward, he would not betray her even if someone tried to win him over. Grace glanced at the corridor leading to the door, feeling uneasy, worried that someone might come in. In fact, the people of the duchy would never allow Grace to confront Tom Perkin alone. Regardless of her status in the family, Tom was a criminal who posed a threat to her. Grace had many things she wanted to know, such as about those drugs, but for now, she would deal with the matter at hand. The information Grace gave Tom Perkin was very valuable. It was about the whereabouts of the Sun's Blessing necklace. It was said that this necklace was passed down through generations of saintesses. When the Empire's first priestess appeared, the emperor of that time had this most beautiful and precious necklace in the world created and named it the Sun's Blessing to commemorate the birth of the priestess. But at some point, the temple stopped showing this necklace to the world, claiming it was to protect the ancient artifact and prevent theft. Grace returned to the annex through a secret passage, feeling her body as weak as a withered flower. At this moment, her stamina was only slightly stronger than a baby deer's. Grace pondered that the current problem was the director's whereabouts. Grace thought that in the major events of the original story, her husband Benjamin always appeared. At this thought, her heart sank for a moment, but then she comforted herself, thinking that helping people in need was a good thing. Grace suppressed the urge to let a happy expression show on her face, feeling secretly pleased. She really wanted to refute those negative voices in her head, thinking, see, she was different from Grace Felton. She could get things done. Grace muttered to herself, stating that she was not Grace, repeatedly saying that she was not Grace Felton. She continued to whisper while sobbing, her voice gradually weakening but not disappearing completely. The morning sun rose, and a quiet atmosphere filled the corridor. Light shone through the curtains, revealing a blurry silhouette hidden in the shadows. Benjamin walked towards Grace, who was sitting on a bench outside, and asked if she was all right. Seeing Benjamin's concerned face, Grace felt a deeper sense of distrust and resentment welling up inside her. She found this feeling strange, different from when she had tried to keep her distance from Benjamin before. This negative emotion was deeper and more persistent than usual, as if it had been forcibly implanted in her. Benjamin asked if Grace would consider going for a walk with him, if she was willing. Faced with this unexpected proposal, Grace immediately asked back, "Aren't you busy?" Benjamin seemed to interpret Grace's question as a polite refusal, and his mood sank. Seeing this, Grace hurriedly explained that it wasn't a refusal, she just thought he would be very busy. Benjamin said he had some free time recently. When Benjamin realized Grace's question was not meant as a refusal, a relieved smile appeared on his face. Grace secretly wondered why Benjamin was so insistent on going out with her. She knew to some extent that Benjamin had a favorable impression of Grace, but it was difficult to judge the specific nature of this fondness. She thought, even if, taking 1,000 steps back, one assumed Benjamin had a person-to-person liking for Grace, then why was Grace treated that way in the original story? As they approached the annex, butler hurried towards Benjamin with a letter bearing the royal seal, telling him there was an urgent matter to look at. Benjamin's expression froze for a moment as he read the letter. Then it returned to normal. In a gentle tone, he told Grace to get ready slowly. A flicker of unease passed through Grace's mind. She looked back and forth between the letter and Benjamin, then nodded, saying she would get ready and come out as soon as possible. Benjamin told her not to rush and watched her walk into the annex with a loving smile. Grace walked out the door and breathed a sigh of relief. She couldn't help but wonder why she felt the estate was an unfavorable place for her. She marveled that just going out could make her feel so full of life. Benjamin, in the carriage, looked caringly at Grace, who was gazing at the scenery outside the window, and said he noticed she didn't like to attract attention, so he had prepared an ordinary carriage, hoping it wouldn't make her uncomfortable. Grace sincerely replied that she didn't feel uncomfortable at all, because although the carriage looked ordinary on the outside, the interior was treated with various kinds of magic, making the seats comfortable and the ride smooth. There was no reason to feel uncomfortable. Hearing Grace's words, Benjamin's worried expression relaxed. Grace asked where they were going. Hearing this question, Benjamin's gentle expression froze for a moment. It quickly returned to normal. He replied that there was a flower house in the suburbs, formerly run by the wife of Marquis Charles. It was built as a glass greenhouse, so the temperature inside was warm and one could see all kinds of flowers. Grace heard the name Charles and found it familiar. As the Duchess of Felton, she might have some connection to Charles, but she just couldn't remember. She also felt there might be another reason. She quickly darted her eyes, trying to remember if it was mentioned in the original story. Her gaze met Benjamin's. Benjamin looked at her. The madam is very interested in flowers. He tried to put on an affectionate expression, but Grace felt he was hesitating about something. Grace worried that asking would seem nosy, but she couldn't help her curiosity. Ever since Benjamin received that letter before she went into the annex, his expression had subtly stiffened. Finally, with concern, she asked Benjamin if something was troubling him. Grace asked Benjamin what was wrong. Benjamin didn't waver at all, saying it was nothing for the madam to worry about. Normally, Grace wouldn't press further, but that day she insisted on getting to the bottom of it, asking if the matter was unimportant. Faced with Grace's question, Benjamin couldn't give a suitable answer. Grace deduced from the seal on the envelope that after the letter from the prince arrived, Benjamin's expression became so stiff. The letter must have contained something important. After a moment of thought, Benjamin finally spoke, telling her it was about the Rondel Canal. Hearing this, Grace made a connection in her mind, thinking this might be related to the official start of the investigation into the pollution problem in the Western region. Benjamin explained that they had completed the purification work on the Rondell Canal, but its condition had deteriorated again. The letter requested if they could conduct a brief investigation on this. Grace's guess was confirmed. Grace hesitated for a moment, then asked Benjamin when he planned to go to the Rondell Canal. Benjamin said he planned to go after this outing was over. Grace felt it would be better to go sooner. The canal was a short distance from the carriage. As they walked closer, a fresh feeling with a hint of water washed over them. They saw some people who seemed to be conducting a preliminary investigation. Judging by their clothes, some of them seemed to be from the temple. Benjamin said those people were performing a purification ritual and mentioned that the saintess was not present today, so the ritual could not be perfectly completed. Benjamin made sure Grace's soft hat was on properly and escorted her into the crowd. Someone asked Benjamin if he had arrived. Benjamin replied that there was no need to be too formal, as that was not the main point right now. After Benjamin and Grace arrived, everyone bowed in greeting. Some people's gazes turned to Grace. Grace felt those gazes and couldn't help but feel a chill down her spine. The representative of the waiting crowd then asked Benjamin his identity. Benjamin informed the person that Grace was his wife. They had an appointment today, but after learning about the situation here, she insisted on accompanying him. Grace tried to pull her hand away from Benjamin's grasp. As Benjamin continued to speak, more people turned their gazes towards them. At this moment, the mortal thoughts that had been lurking resurfaced. They mocked Grace, asserting that people would be disappointed, and accused her of just hiding and doing nothing. Just at that moment, golden power drifted down from somewhere, sparkling in the air. Someone shouted, "Saintess Alia." The gazes that were on Grace all shifted. Alia said she heard the Rondell Canal was polluted again, so she urgently used her divine power. At the same time, she worried if the magic tool workshop would be affected. With Alia's appearance, the golden power that filled the sky gradually dissipated. Grace turned to look at Alia. She was as vibrant and beautiful as when they first met. But at this moment, Grace was not concerned with her appearance. Rather, it was that with the appearance of the golden power and Alia, the tormenting voices that had been bothering her had weakened. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. Alia had been watching Grace from the moment she noticed her presence. Grace was puzzled as to why Alia was watching her. After all, when she first met Alia, she had disguised herself with a magic item. It seemed strange that Alia would recognize her now. Just then, the anxious voices of priests came from behind. They reminded Alia that she shouldn't release her divine power like that, because its strength could cause the magic tool workshop to grind to a halt. Alia apologized for this. While most people's attention was focused on Alia, Benjamin led Grace towards the canal and said to Grace that if there was no commotion, the magic tool workshop should be fine. While talking to Grace, Benjamin occasionally glanced at Alia. Grace understood that the relationship between magic items and divine power had always been tense. It was normal for Benjamin to be worried. In fact, the relationship was even worse than tense. Grace asked Benjamin if he had a message to convey to the saintess. Benjamin was startled by the question and quickly shook his head in denial, saying he just wanted to introduce Grace. This was a sharp contrast to his usual gentle demeanor, a rather strong reaction. Grace thought to herself that a strong denial often means affirmation. But for some reason, at this moment, she didn't feel any suspicion or worry. This was in stark contrast to the voices that had been appearing in her mind recently, making it difficult for her to concentrate on her surroundings. For a while, the blessed area had no problems, but since the root of the pollution was in the west, it was natural for the problem to reappear over time. Only Grace knew that if there was a problem, the source was in the west. She thought to herself, of course, if things continue like this, eventually everyone will find out. Benjamin noticed Grace's face turning pale and asked if she was feeling unwell. Grace replied no. She had recently experienced abdominal pain, and because of her poor physical condition for a long time, her body had been unwell. Grace gently tugged on Benjamin's arm, saying she was really fine, just thinking about something. Flustered by Benjamin's gaze, Grace came up with a rough solution, asking if it was possible to track the pollution with divine power. Benjamin was puzzled by this. Grace further explained that he had previously mentioned the saintess could use her abilities widely, so she guessed that perhaps the saintess could also detect the direction of the pollution. At that moment, the priest in charge of the Rondel Canal proposal found Benjamin, handed him the confirmation letter for the canal, and asked him to sign it. He also asked if he had time now to discuss the recent events of the Rondel Canal, mentioning that Alia was still surrounded by a crowd. Benjamin said that his clever wife had asked an interesting question. Grace was puzzled, thinking she had no other choice. She was surprised by Benjamin's words, but Benjamin seemed very happy. If Grace's feeling was correct, Benjamin was truly enjoying himself. Benjamin said it seemed the saintess was busy attending to other people. Grace asked if that was so. Benjamin nodded, then looked at Alia, who was so tightly surrounded by the crowd that she was barely visible. He explained that greetings usually have an order, and they shouldn't ignore that. Perhaps this incident had shocked them so much that they forgot. He said he could understand, as no one wants to be criticized for doing something wrong. Benjamin said it would be best for the madam to explain it directly herself, rather than him doing it on her behalf, as he was worried he might misrepresent the content. Grace said she wanted to get on the carriage first. She thought she could handle it, but now she felt she couldn't bear it. Benjamin asked if she was very tired and if she could wait in the carriage. Grace said she would be fine alone. Grace pulled open the curtain on the carriage and looked out. She saw Benjamin walking alone towards Alia. After the crowd dispersed, Alia met with Benjamin. Grace thought they were a really good match. Perhaps it was because they both looked so gentle, even standing side by side at a distance. It was obvious they were a perfect pair. Grace drew the curtain again and leaned back against the seat. She thought it was strange. Usually, strange thoughts would pop in her head at times like this, but right now, she heard nothing. Her heart was a little uneasy, but not as intensely as before. There was no feeling of suffocation, nor did she want to escape elsewhere. Grace found this strange and closed her eyes for a moment. After a while, Grace heard a soft whisper telling her to wake up. At first, she just heard the voice, then she felt a careful touch. The touch was gentle and meticulous, tidying her messy hair. Grace didn't know when she had fallen asleep. Now her eyelids were heavy. Her mind was clear, but she couldn't open her eyes. She guessed it was because she hadn't slept well last night. She didn't remember what she dreamed, only that it was hard to wake up. Her body felt heavy from the poor sleep last night. Benjamin muttered to himself that it had taken too long. His gentle voice came from nearby. Grace managed to lift her heavy eyelids and slowly open her eyes, seeing Benjamin's face close to hers. Seeing this, Benjamin quickly leaned back, looking very embarrassed. With mixed feelings, Grace looked at the slightly blushing Benjamin in front of her and asked if he had properly finished his work. Benjamin said he had, and that was why he wanted to wake Grace up to tell her the good news as soon as possible. Grace wondered if the method she had proposed was really feasible. Benjamin smiled broadly, seeming to see through her doubt. He immediately said that tracking the pollution was indeed feasible. Although it might take some time, they could create a form to extract and guide the essence of the saintess's power, as if tracking a pollutant. When this proposal was made, some were surprised, questioning how the saintess's power could be used merely for tracking pollutants. However, the proposal was the most reasonable because the saintess's power was fundamentally different from that of other priests. If she set her mind to it, she could use her power like a spring that never runs dry, and with enough skill, she would never tire. Just as Benjamin finished speaking, a maid hurried in from outside, apologizing for the interruption, and then informed them that there was a fire. A messenger had just brought the news. This sudden news of a fire made Grace feel dizzy. Benjamin saw her stiff expression and asked where the fire was. The maid replied that it was near the orphanage. Hearing it was the orphanage, Grace immediately rushed out, running without a second thought. As Grace and Benjamin approached the billowing smoke, a bright morning light entered their eyes. Grace couldn't help but think it was strange. The light was so bright and hot that it hurt her eyes. It was clearly night, yet it was as bright as if the sun had risen. The guard accompanying Benjamin recognized him, saluted him, and called him, "Your Grace the Duke." After dismounting, Benjamin helped Grace dismount, then asked what had happened here and if there were any casualties. The guard informed him that a fire had suddenly broken out at the orphanage. Fortunately, only a few people had minor injuries, and there were no deaths. Benjamin then asked if it was a simple accident. The guard said it didn't seem to be, and pointed to a man lying in the corner with severe burns, saying that this man was found unconscious at the scene of the fire. It has been confirmed that this orphanage only houses young women and children, so he is very likely the suspect. Benjamin looked at the motionless man and muttered to himself that in his current state, he couldn't speak. The guard hesitated at his reaction. The man immediately responded to Benjamin, asking what was wrong. The guard replied, "Nothing." Cleta, who had been checking on the children, carefully interjected, first apologizing for the interruption. Benjamin recognized her as Miss Cleta. Cleta had seen Benjamin's face at the festival where they first met, and only now realized he was the Duke, so she lowered her head. Benjamin told her to raise her head, saying it was all right. Benjamin let Cleta speak. Cleta explained that the man used to be the director of this orphanage. She wasn't sure how he had slipped in, nor was she sure if he had been hiding here from the beginning. He set fire to the place where the oil was stored. Strangely, he didn't flee after starting the fire. Judging from his physical condition, he seemed to have gone through a difficult time. Benjamin speculated that this was not a deliberate act of self-destruction, but an act of desperation. Cleta continued, saying that the man had said some strange things before he lost consciousness. She seemed to hesitate, stopping and starting, as if she was about to say something she shouldn't. Benjamin waited for her to continue. The guards looked somewhat uneasy for some reason. Just then, a guard who had walked over from a distance said that the man, before he lost consciousness, said it was revenge against the Duchess. Hearing this, Benjamin narrowed his eyes and turned to look at Grace. Cleta's gaze, which had been fixed on Benjamin, also turned to Grace. Grace's steps retreated slightly. She thought revenge? As far as she knew, she hadn't done anything that deserved revenge. At this moment, the wind picked up, blowing her hair, which was tightly combed under her hat, into motion. Her red hair, illuminated by the bright flames, looked as if it were burning. Finally, Benjamin put his own coat over Grace's shoulders, shielding her behind him, and suggested they go back first. In reality, even hiding behind Benjamin, Grace had nowhere to hide. Many people had come to watch the accident. A crowd gathered behind Benjamin. The man who had just reported the situation had a loud voice, and some people nearby heard his words clearly. Someone who heard the report said in confusion, they said it was revenge against the Duchess. Another person mentioned that there are many dukes, and someone else pointed out it was the duke closest to here. The crowd's gazes seemed to be fixed on Grace's back. This made it difficult for her to breathe. The voices echoing in her head, intertwined with people's suspicions, made her head spin even more. She couldn't help but make a sound of ugh. Benjamin kept comforting Grace, saying it was okay, but Grace wasn't sure what exactly was okay. Benjamin lifted her head. His warm voice contrasted with his stern expression. Then he said to the person who had reported too loudly that he had spread unconfirmed news for everyone to hear and should be prepared to face the consequences. After that, Benjamin helped Grace back onto her horse. In fact, he didn't want to leave just like that. There was no time to wait for a carriage. Grace grabbed the edge of Benjamin's sleeve, her face pale, and asked softly where the people from the orphanage would go. Even in this situation, seeing Grace still caring about others, Benjamin frowned. He said, "Even now, you're still most worried about them," and said he would take them to a safe place. Grace agreed. Benjamin then said that if Grace didn't mind, he would bring the people from the orphanage to the ducal residence. Benjamin comforted Grace, telling her to rest for a while. He then called over a guard and whispered something to him. Grace's ears were ringing, her vision blurred, and her consciousness gradually faded. After that, she couldn't remember anything more. Grace opened her eyes and saw the all-too-familiar ceiling. She recognized this place as the annex. At first, it felt strange to her, but now it was the place she returned to. All the hallucinations tormented her again, as if that brief moment of clarity was a lie. Grace pressed her throbbing head and pulled the bell cord next to her. Sally appeared at the summons and asked if Grace was awake. Grace asked Sally to tell her what had happened while she was lying down. Sally informed Grace that while she was asleep, a guest had arrived at the main residence, and His Highness had also made a trip to the Imperial Palace. Grace said she understood. At Grace's request, Benjamin had the people from the orphanage stay in the main residence. Some people praised the Duke for helping those who suddenly had nowhere to go, while others criticized it as an attempt to suppress the rumors about Grace. Even without seeing Grace in person, she could clearly feel the unfriendly gazes. She wondered if it was because she knew the plot of the original story. Recalling the hostile gazes directed at Grace in the original story, she felt a bitter taste in her mouth. Grace looked at her own cheeks and asked the flustered Sally if she could prepare the tea room to receive a guest. Sally agreed. Grace then asked Sally to call Cleta Dunn from the main building, saying she had something important to discuss. Sally replied that she understood and said she would send a maid to help Grace with her hair and makeup. Grace thanked Sally. Sally didn't ask any more questions, just gave her a worried look before leaving the room. Grace took a deep breath. She got up from the bed in the now empty room. Physically, she felt much lighter than before, but every movement made her body feel soft and weak, like jelly. Grace looked in a mirror. In the mirror, a woman with a smaller frame than before looked back at her. The critical voices echoed in her mind, questioning why she kept doing meaningless things, saying it was all pointless. They also mocked her. Look in the mirror, there's no big change at all. Still ugly. The tea room was a cozy space. Although Grace was still uneasy inside, for the visitor, Cleta Dunn, it was warm and pleasant. Grace personally poured tea for Cleta. Cleta asked if it was all right for her to have come. Grace replied that she was a guest and to please let her serve her. After learning Grace's true identity, Cleta felt uncomfortable receiving such respect and hospitality. After all, given her situation, apart from those who sympathized with her and her companions, everyone else looked down on her. But Grace, despite her higher status than anyone, treated her with respect and equality. Grace pushed the snacks placed in the center of the table towards Cleta, telling her she had something she wanted to ask for her help with, and first thanked her for taking the trouble to come. Cleta was startled by Grace's words and quickly denied that it was any trouble. She said Grace had helped her so much. Grace mentioned what happened yesterday. Cleta said she didn't believe those rumors. After a brief silence, Cleta hesitated and said that they should be the ones apologizing to Grace, because those people had been making wild guesses in front of Grace, and the content of the newspapers was not entirely true. Grace then said she had another proposal. Cleta's eyes widened at the word proposal, realizing that this was more directly related to her than a simple request. Grace suggested that, considering the burnt-down orphanage, how about moving to a new place? Cleta replied that even if they wanted to move, they had no funds. Grace mentioned that the tea bags they made but didn't sell might still have some left, but that wasn't all. She added that there had been many discussions about various contracts recently, and they were preparing for mass production, but the materials had not yet arrived. She proposed moving their residence to an area near the tea plantation, saying there should be an empty house there, though it might be a bit old. But Cleta and the children could all live there. Cleta said she understood. Cleta asked where they planned to move. Grace said she might have to discuss it with His Highness. Cleta looked at Grace apologetically, saying they were always receiving Grace's help, a debt they could never repay, even in death. Grace replied it was nothing. Cleta begged her not to say that. Grace said it was just information she happened to know. She believed she could casually propose solutions because she knew the original story. Grace thought how wonderful it would be if everyone used shared information to do good deeds and help others. Unfortunately, not everyone was like that. Realizing this again, she fell silent, feeling that she wasn't actually that amazing. She thought that without this information, she wouldn't have so easily extended a helping hand to them. As fate would have it, Benjamin went to the Imperial Palace in connection with the Western pollution problem. Thanks to Alia's ability, they discovered within 24 hours that the pollution was related to a remote suburb in the Western region. After Benjamin returned, he and Grace took a slow walk in the garden to discuss the matter. Benjamin said that with the Saints' help, they were able to deduce that the source of the contamination was quite far away. In fact, this was thanks to Grace's suggestion. Grace responded that she was able to think of such a method because the Saintess was there. Benjamin, however, said that there is always a need for people who think from different perspectives. After all, no one else had come up with the idea, so Grace was truly remarkable. Seeing Grace fall silent, Benjamin suddenly asked with concern if something he said had upset her. Grace snapped out of her thoughts and then mentioned that there was something she wanted to ask of Benjamin. Benjamin replied that if it was Grace's request, he would do his best to grant it. Grace stated that she wanted to accompany Benjamin on the upcoming mission to the contaminated area. Benjamin, who had seemed ready to do anything for Grace, closed his mouth after hearing her request, a confused expression on his face. He explained to Grace that going to the contaminated area could be extremely dangerous, and it was a serious mission. He wasn't sure if her body could handle it. Grace said that His Highness also knew about the relevant situation. Although she didn't specify what she was referring to, Benjamin understood her meaning and raised an eyebrow. Grace emphasized that it would be better if she went with Benjamin. Benjamin still had reservations. Grace then said she felt very stifled. Hearing this, Benjamin couldn't help but look at her with concern again. Grace also promised she wouldn't be a burden and wanted to contribute to the mission if she could. Benjamin stood there blankly, and Grace wasn't sure if he was listening to her. After some deep thought, Benjamin finally agreed to Grace's request in a low voice. After Benjamin agreed to let Grace accompany him to the western outskirts, Grace became busy. Grace initially had doubts about making these decisions. Later, she learned that the imperial palace had readily approved the matter. The reason was simple. She mused that she had never thought the divorce consideration period would be so useful. This trip was classified as a couple's volunteer activity and even received praise because it made them look like they were trying to mend their relationship. Grace even had the fleeting thought that she could take advantage of this. She couldn't help but sigh. She had previously thought the aid story was developing smoothly, but now it seemed that was not the case. Sally said that she would do her utmost to serve the Duchess during the journey and told her not to worry. Grace replied that having Sally with her made her feel much more at ease. Sally, in turn, said guiltily that she should have done better. Sally mentioned that Lord Vantland had also decided to accompany her. No one would dare to disrespect him. Grace was taken aback by the term disrespect, thinking that no matter how lowly she was viewed, she was still the Duchess of Felton. Although she and Benjamin had no love between them, their relationship wasn't bad. Benjamin would stand up for her against unfair treatment. She couldn't help but wonder if she was really that easy to bully, feeling that the impression she gave might not be strong enough. Grace guessed the reason for the maid's behavior, suspecting it might be related to Aria. No one said it outright, but perhaps they noticed Benjamin's behavior. Grace recalled that when Benjamin went to the temple to help with matters related to the Rondel Canal activities, he had seemed hesitant when reporting his whereabouts to her. From this, she thought she seemed to understand why the maid supported her. Seeing the maid's supportive gazes, her heart warmed. Although she had once thought they might find her troublesome, they had always supported her. Having allies made her feel more secure and at ease. Grace mused that in her previous life, no one had ever given her this kind of support. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly as she expressed her genuine gratitude. The maids, who had been chattering just moments before, fell silent instantly upon seeing the faint smile that appeared on Grace's face for the first time in a long while. They thought to themselves that their lady hadn't smiled since last year, but now she finally had. Just as the maids were lost in the moment, Grace asked if His Highness was in the main residence. The maids replied that His Highness was currently in the main residence. Just then, Benjamin appeared before them. He apologized for being late and said they could leave immediately. Grace hurriedly said it was fine and that they could leave at their own pace. Inwardly, she was thinking that while the contamination problem in the West was worrying, there might be an even greater danger. Grace thought that the ducal physician was not her personal doctor. According to imperial law, a prescription was required to purchase medicine in solid form. For this reason, every medicine differed in size, color, shape, and markings. This was to comprehensively classify and control medicines to ensure the correct prescriptions were issued. This achievement was thanks to the rapid development of pharmacology through active exchange between countries. The current emperor's younger brother, Duke Arte, played a central role in this. He was made a duke not only because of his royal status, but also because he led medical development and improved the quality of life for the empire's citizens. Grace speculated that her original self must have been interested in medicine from the beginning. After all, Duke Arte barely appeared in the novel, yet the Duchess of Felton knew a great deal about him. Grace felt like she was going to be sick. Her head was splitting, her stomach was churning, and her vision was blurring. She remembered her promise not to be a burden and finally couldn't help but lie down in the carriage. They arrived at their destination earlier than expected. As the group approached Count Adele's territory, they couldn't help but exclaim at the desolate sight caused by the contamination. Faced with this terrible scene, everyone fell silent. The condition at the very edge of the territory was even worse. The trees were dying, and only withered weeds remained on the once cultivated land. People seemed to be waiting for death, their doors shut tight. With a determined expression, Benjamin was the first to dismount, proposing to distribute the relief supplies first. Grace came to her senses and scrambled to get off the carriage. Benjamin naturally walked to her side to help. Grace hesitantly stated the arrangements. Some people would be responsible for taking out and sorting the relief supplies, while those not involved in sorting would help count the number of recipients. Benjamin immediately said he could help count the people. Grace was a little surprised. At that moment, Benjamin looked around around and saw a person in the distance hurrying towards them. Aserting greeted Benjamin, calling him Your Highness. Benjamin replied that he had worked hard. Aserting was Benjamin's aide. Aserting didn't look tired at all. He handed Benjamin the documents he was carrying. The documents were a list organized by the number of residents in the territory and the urgency of the patients. Benjamin praised him for a job well done. Aserting stated that it was his duty to assist His Highness and that he was deeply honored to act on His Highness's behalf. Grace glanced at Aserting and saw him speaking with a deadpan, serious expression. Grace looked somewhat awkwardly towards the geologists in the distance who were helping to move luggage, looking bewildered. She said she had something for them to do and asked if she could take them aside. She received an affirmative reply, as these were the people she had summoned. Grace expressed her thanks. The other party replied that he should be the one thanking her. Benjamin gently took hold of Grace's carrot-colored curly hair, saying that thanks to her, everyone was able to find the source of the contamination faster and prepare. If they had been any later, the losses would have been greater than they were now. After hearing this, Grace's heart began to feel ticklish again. She replied that it was nothing, that His Highness was willing to listen to her insignificant words. The feeling was strange. It was ticklish, awkward, and uncomfortable all at once. Grace felt it was because of this conversation with Benjamin, so she quickly moved away from him. The current time was noon, and there was still a long time until sunset. After the geologists were ready, Grace divided the team into groups. The small groups, selected from the numerous personnel, dispersed to the village to inspect the soil and select crops that would be useful in the current situation. However, it was a mine in name only, producing nothing of value. The ore quality was poor, its color dull, and even cheap jewelry shops were unwilling to buy it. In the original plot, after Aria purified Count Adele's territory, the temple would regularly inspect the contamination levels and perform additional purification work when necessary. The local people were both grateful and guilty, not knowing how to repay the kindness. So, a representative priest who participated in the expedition at the time requested that the mine on this land be donated to the temple. In reality, the temple had just taken a difficult-to-manage mine off their hands. This later became a much-told story. Grace thought that if she were from the temple, she would have requested a portion of the first crops planted after the land's recovery, or asked them to help others in similarly difficult situations. This would have made it easier to maintain the temple's status. So, Grace instructed those not checking the soil in the village to head to the forest. She asked if they had brought a compass and demanded they return before dark. She also mentioned that there might not be any wild beasts in the forest, but if anyone was afraid to go, they could find the red-haired knight, Rosalia, over there. The geologist handed Grace a simple map drawn on the way. Grace felt that the people selected were more meticulous than she had imagined, speculating that the person in charge of management, out of respect for Benjamin, would not have sent mediocre people. Grace asked Benjamin, "Your Highness, do you happen to have time tonight?" Benjamin, who was drinking water and catching his breath, choked and coughed upon hearing the question. Grace asked with concern if His Highness was all right. Affected by the aftermath of his coughing, Benjamin's cheeks and ears turned red. He patted himself while saying he was fine and felt very comfortable. Grace glanced around briefly, thinking that the current environment didn't seem as comfortable as Benjamin described, but decided not to dwell on the topic. Benjamin informed Grace that he had plenty of time for her. The people here had decided to conduct reconnaissance work together tonight. As long as they avoided that time slot, it would be fine. When mentioning the reconnaissance work, Benjamin's voice grew hesitant. Grace thought that it was not easy for Benjamin, as the leader of the expedition team, to make time for her. Besides, he didn't need to personally confirm the contaminated areas in the forest. Benjamin, blushing, replied that he would finish his work as soon as possible and go to Grace's quarters. He also told her to go to sleep first if he was late. Grace inexplicably swallowed, feeling as if she were doing something she shouldn't be. Late at night, Grace was holding a lantern. Benjamin saw it and questioned her. Grace asked what was wrong, Your Highness. Benjamin said it was nothing and took the lantern from Grace's hand. Benjamin said that Grace had mentioned having something important to discuss, and he had thought they would have a private conversation. Grace retorted that they could talk on the way. Benjamin thought it was still about work. Work and private matters were different. Grace countered that they were on an expedition, not on official duty 24/7. Benjamin agreed with this statement. Grace found it amusing. In the novel, before his corruption, Benjamin was mature and composed. But now he was saying unnecessary things whining like a child. Benjamin continued, saying that entering the forest late at night could lead to getting lost. Grace replied that His Highness was busy with other things during the day. Benjamin then said that checking the contaminated areas during the day was more efficient, constantly expressing his worries. Grace said they wouldn't get lost. Benjamin was confused. Grace explained that she had people tie ribbons along the path. Ordinary ribbons couldn't be seen at night. The ribbons she gave the geologists were coated with fluorescent paint. It was colorless, but could emit a faint glow at night. This was a product made using magic and fluorescent stones, not yet released to the public. The Duke of Felton, as a patron and supporter of the Magical Tool Association, was able to receive many new products in advance. The fluorescent paint was one of them. Grace also thought that because the Duke of Felton owned most of the high-quality stones, magical tool makers, to avoid offending the family, always sent new products to the Duke first. However, Benjamin wasn't the type of person to secretly retaliate against others just because he was in a bad mood. No, Grace thought Benjamin might retaliate secretly. Just think about the developments in the latter half of the story. Although Benjamin always wore a pleasant smile, no one could truly see through his inner thoughts. Grace briefly glanced at Benjamin from the corner of her eye. Grace analyzed to Benjamin that if he and she entered the forest together during the day, it would inevitably attract everyone's attention. For safety reasons, some members of the expedition team might have to go to the trouble of providing cover and accompanying them. After hearing this, Benjamin responded with a Grace continued, saying that others had already confirmed there were no traces of wild beasts or animals in the forest. It wasn't just hunters who could tell. She knew that animal senses were sharper than humans. If a place was unsuitable for living or considered dangerous, animals would migrate their habitat. Therefore, it was impossible for animals to exist near the source of the contamination near Count Adele's territory. Suddenly, Benjamin stopped in his tracks. Grace asked what was wrong. Benjamin said in a low voice that he had a strange feeling while carefully drawing his sword. Grace asked him in a low voice if he sensed something. Benjamin replied that the feeling was surprisingly similar to the aura of a monster. Hearing this, Grace repeated in surprise, "A monster?" Benjamin confirmed, saying the aura was very faint and only someone familiar with monsters would notice it. Grace then asked if it was dangerous. Benjamin said it wasn't quite the same as that kind of conventional danger. He frowned slightly, as if he didn't quite understand it himself. Grace wondered to herself, what on earth did he feel? Something flickered in the shadows. Benjamin asked what she had found. Grace pointed to the glowing spot and said something was shining over there. Benjamin must have seen it too, as he told Grace to wait and walked in. After picking it up, Benjamin's expression became meaningful. Grace saw the object in Benjamin's hand and wondered. The thing wasn't bad, but it wasn't what Benjamin had expected. His expression seemed to convey that it had similarities to what he knew, but it wasn't exactly the same. What could it be? Grace stared for a long time, growing impatient, and asked Benjamin if the thing was dangerous. Benjamin replied that it wasn't. Then, Benjamin walked to Grace's side and showed her the object in his hand. Grace saw that it was a stone. She couldn't help but guess, rather than a stone, could this be a gem? As Grace was lost in thought, she suddenly noticed something unusual about the stone in Benjamin's hand. Her eyes widened, and she let out a gasp of "oh." Benjamin was startled by her cry. Grace quickly grabbed Benjamin's hand that was holding the lantern. Benjamin didn't expect her to do that so suddenly and froze in surprise, asking why the Duchess had suddenly grabbed his hand. Grace couldn't contain her excitement, moving the lantern back and forth over the stone. Following her movements, Benjamin quickly understood and noticed that the stone's color was changing. Grace asked him if he had ever seen such a gem before. Benjamin said no. This was the first time he had seen one, right? Grace emphasized excitedly. Her eyes sparkled as she looked at the gem, noticing that it changed into various colors depending on the intensity of the light. She thought it was like an aurora, although she had never seen an aurora in real life. The beauty of the gem made her imagine that if an aurora were to descend upon the earth, it might look just like this. Benjamin couldn't help but exclaim that the gem was truly beautiful. Even if it wasn't a magic stone, it had value in itself. After all, people are always attracted to beautiful things, especially a gem like this that had never been seen in the world before. Its value was already proven. Grace then asked, "Your Highness Benjamin, may I ask a somewhat presumptuous question?" Benjamin permitted her to ask. So Grace asked, "Is it possible to buy this mine?" Hearing this question, Benjamin fell into a brief, thoughtful silence, as if weighing the matter. Afterward, Benjamin said that it might be a good idea. Grace asked in pleasant surprise, "Really?" Benjamin explained that regardless of whether the gem came from here, buying the mine was an opportunity to support the contaminated region. There were initiatives everywhere to redevelop abandoned mines. Benjamin clearly stated the answer Grace was hoping for, but he also pointed out that if they were to do this, they would need to provide adequate compensation to the other contaminated areas. Although Count Adele's territory was the most affected, it didn't mean other regions hadn't suffered. Grace agreed with this view, nodding and saying yes. She added that on the way here, several places were deteriorating. It wasn't just this one area that was affected. A few days later, Aria arrived, leading a group at Count Adele's territory. Someone announced that these were relief supplies sent by Duke Arte. Grace was surprised to hear this, thinking, sent by Duke Arte? She knew the original story never mentioned such support. It was clear to her that Duke Arte sending supplies did not align with the original plot. Grace had originally thought that the Saintess Aria would have to go and request the supplies in person. This was both strange and unsettling, but Grace judged that there was no reason to refuse the supplies at the moment. She also thought that with these supplies, they could also help the other affected areas they had encountered on the way here. So she proposed to inspect the supplies and distribute them accordingly. Benjamin then said to the porters, "Could you move all of this to the tent where the relief supplies are managed?" The porter hesitated with a troubled look and replied, but another person noticed and came over, asking, "Is there a problem?" As soon as Grace saw the new face, she immediately recognized the person and her eyes widened in surprise. She recognized this person as Boris Benedict. He had long, platinum blonde hair tied back and deep blue eyes. His appearance was like that of an angel. Grace thought that if Aria was here, then Boris would definitely be here too. When Aria attended official events as the Saintess, Boris was always by her side. When Aria first became the Saintess, a few priests did not think highly of her. The moment Boris saw her, he immediately acknowledged and supported her as the Saintess. Boris himself was highly respected in the temple, holding a considerably high rank for his age. It was natural for Aria, as the Saintess, to be loved by all, but Boris's help played a significant role in her quickly establishing herself. Grace thought that in the original story, Boris had always been a kind person. She secretly glanced at Boris and then quickly looked away. When Grace was a reader, she had been quite fond of Boris. Her affection for Boris, though not to the extent of her feelings for Benjamin or the main characters, was significant. Boris's role and presence were more akin to a male supporting character. In some ways, his character positioning was even more distinct than Benjamin's. The only reason Boris didn't become a male supporting character was that he played the role of Aria's guardian in the story. Grace thought to herself that this was precisely why she liked Boris. He was Aria's supporter, the one who protected Aria in the temple. From beginning to end, he was Aria's pillar of strength. Boris said that the Duchess, representing the Empire's nobility, had taken the lead in the original action. It was only natural for these respectable people to express their gratitude by sending gifts and to express their thanks with all their might. After a moment of contemplation, Grace spoke up, saying that while she couldn't disrespect Duke Arte's goodwill, she would accept a portion of the gifts. And as Boris had seen on his journey, she believed it would be more beneficial to pass on more of the Duke's kindness to the people of the Empire, which would also be a fitting return for his sincerity. Before sunset, Sally and Grace were focused on leaving after completing their tasks. Just then, they noticed a group of people gathered together. Grace wondered what was going on over there. Sally asked what had happened, as there was no reason for people to be gathering now. After getting Grace's permission, Sally went forward and asked a man who looked like a temple knight what had happened. The temple knight replied that the Saintess's belongings had been stolen. Grace frowned upon hearing this, because another twist different from the original plot had occurred. She wondered why this was happening. She knew that if her actions differed from the original plot, different things could happen. But she couldn't figure out what this theft had to do with her actions at all. Grace swallowed nervously and asked the temple knight what had been stolen. This temple knight was much taller than both her and Sally. For some reason, he gave off an imposing feeling. Grace thought he's almost as tall as Boris. It's strange. I didn't feel this much danger when I faced Boris before. Why does this knight make me feel so terrified? Grace asked where the Saintess was now. The temple knight replied that the Saintess had gone to see the river with His Highness the Crown Prince. Their goal was to catch the culprit and resolve the issue before the saint is found out. Grace knew that Aria's abilities were closely tied to her emotions. Understanding their intention to solve the problem before negative emotions could affect Aria, she said, "In that case, is there anything I can do to help?" The knight hesitated for a moment, then carefully said that they had been ordered to inspect the Duchess's quarters. He clearly understood the gravity of such a presumptuous act, but showed no sign of backing down. Hearing the knight's words, Sally's voice rose sharply as she questioned, "How dare you? Are you suspecting the Duchess now?" Grace was about to reassure Sally that it was fine when heavy footsteps were heard nearby. Rosalia stated that suspecting the Duchess was tantamount to suspecting the entire house of Felton. The Temple Knight explained that they didn't suspect the Duchess. They were just checking her quarters as a precaution. Rosalia questioned this. They hadn't even investigated the other tents or the entire territory, yet they wanted to inspect the Duchess's quarters. It sounded very suspicious. Seeing the situation, Grace told Rosalia that she was fine and speculated that perhaps the knight made this request because the spare tent was close to her quarters. Rosalia glared at the knight and muttered under her breath that if they found nothing in the Duchess's quarters, they would have to apologize to her. The knight affirmed this and then bowed to Grace. At that moment, a loud shout came from the front. "Found it!" Grace and Sally, their eyes full of confusion, looked towards the knight who had shouted. They saw him holding a gem necklace, so dazzling it hurt their eyes. Someone pointed out that the necklace didn't belong to the Duchess. Grace also wondered why the necklace was here. She turned her head and saw a crowd of onlookers, realizing that everyone's eyes were focused on her. Someone demanded that Grace explain the origin of the necklace. Grace said she knew nothing about it, stating that she and Sally had just been distributing food. She didn't understand why. Even though she was telling the truth, her voice trembled uncontrollably, just like a child caught lying on the spot. Sally vouched for Grace, saying that the Duchess hadn't returned to her quarters all day. Someone mentioned that there was once a young girl who tried to steal the saintess's things and insisted on her innocence, but her crime was quickly exposed. Grace knew that was a plot point from the original story, but she insisted that she really didn't do it. Just as she was filled with regret, she heard Benjamin's voice. "What is going on?" "Madam," Benjamin asked, "can you tell me what happened?" Grace replied that the gift Duke Arte sent to the Saintess was found in her quarters. Benjamin guessed if it was possible they got mixed up while moving things. Grace denied it. An inexplicable warmth welled up in Grace's heart as she realized Benjamin believed her. However, she also understood that Benjamin's belief alone was not enough to solve the problem. It just restored a little of her will to face the issue. Grace slowly lifted her head, which had been hanging low, and first looked at Benjamin. Then she turned her head to look at the hand of the knight holding the necklace box, and finally at the place where the relief supplies were neatly stacked. After looking around at the gathered crowd, Grace hesitantly stated that she did not do this. Grace thought that although she didn't know the exact motive, the culprit must be among them. Someone had hidden the necklace in her quarters for some reason. She couldn't help but wonder what that reason was. Grace suppressed her unease and asked the Temple Knight where the item was found. The knight replied, "Right here," pointing to where Grace's belongings were piled. It was a location visible at a glance. Based on this, Grace judged that it was very likely an inside job. Grace said to the Temple Knight, "Let me see that jewelry box." After a brief inspection, Grace placed the box in Benjamin's hands. She asked him to hold it for a moment. Grace began to gently tap on the jewelry box with a brush covered in powder. Grace knew that this world didn't have fingerprint identification technology. If it did, the culprit would have been more careful. As she tapped, leaving traces of white powder, several fingerprints appeared on the seemingly clean jewelry box. Grace thought that both the Temple Knight and Benjamin were wearing gloves, so they wouldn't have left fingerprints. Therefore, it was highly likely that only her fingerprints and the culprits were on it, and perhaps Aria's. After all, the gift from Duke Arte had been polished to a shine by Sally. If Aria's side was just as meticulous, it was very possible that only 2 sets of fingerprints remained. Then Grace explained to the priest, "Look closely. Everyone has unique patterns on their fingertips called fingerprints, and everyone's is different. I plan to compare the fingerprints left here with yours. If they match, you are the culprit." After hearing this, the priest reacted with an "ah," exclaiming that this was utter nonsense. Grace replied, "We'll know if it's nonsense after we compare them." She also added that if the priest had any doubts, they could also compare the fingerprints of others. If he was still clearly identified as the culprit after that, she would file a formal complaint with the temple. As expected, this priest was the culprit. He couldn't refute Grace's words and fell silent. The atmosphere was more lively than expected. The matter was quickly resolved. However, it wasn't a clamor of anger, but one filled with surprise and astonishment. Priest Boris did come to apologize, but considering he had nearly tarnished the honor of the duchy. His attitude, however, was cold. He even emphasized that the temple's prestige was higher in this place. And then he left. Outside the bustling crowd, someone stopped and asked what happened, but received no response. Golden eyes blinked, staring at Grace. Even as Sylvester called out to Aria, Aria remained motionless, just staring at Grace, her eyes seemingly beckoning. Soon, this seemingly ugly woman raised her head and met the gaze of the most noble lady in the world. Grace wondered what? She saw the female protagonist, Aria, standing clearly outside the crowd. She was certain she would never mistake her. That night, Aria and Sylvester left the gathering and walked into the forest alone. They weren't there for anything special, but to deepen their bond. Grace thought to herself that she had been to this forest before. She had previously explored the forest's nighttime charm under various pretexts, using fluorescent ribbons to guide the way back then. This time, however, there was no need. In the sparse forest, sound traveled with exceptional clarity. Grace pondered. It was said that Aria and Sylvester would talk by the lake connected to the river. She couldn't help but tilt her head in confusion. How could there be a lake in this desolate land? In reality, the lake was almost dry, with only a thin stream connecting to what could barely be called a lake. The lake bed was completely exposed, but the presence of flowing water meant it hadn't completely dried up. The death of land occurs in stages. As contamination worsens, the land eventually dies completely, with no water source remaining. Grace noticed this contradiction and frowned, thinking, doesn't this mean that the current state of this land can still be purified by Aria? Under the moonlight, Grace saw a man and a woman standing side by side. In that moment, she understood why they were the main characters. She marveled at their breathtaking beauty, thinking that if an artist saw this scene, they would surely be inspired to create the masterpiece of a lifetime. This scene was far beyond what perfect could describe. Just as she was thinking about what would happen next, Grace sensed someone behind her. Benjamin's voice came from behind. He said he was wondering where Grace had gone. In the original story, Benjamin had watched Aria and Sylvester's secret moonlit rendezvous from afar. That scene was described as incredibly poignant, tinged with a hint of bitterness and loneliness, occupying an entire night's chapter. Among them, Grace remembered Benjamin saying, "I'm so envious." Grace couldn't help but guess if he felt the same way now. She secretly glanced towards Benjamin, thinking it was impossible for him not to have noticed Aria and Sylvester. Sure enough, Benjamin's gaze was fixed on Aria and Sylvester. Grace felt the atmosphere was strange, so it was hard to put into words, but she felt that Benjamin seemed to be looking at something else. Benjamin's expression was tinged with bitterness and loneliness, just as the novel had described. His eyes were fixed on Aria and Sylvester, yet they seemed to see something beyond them. Grace wondered what he was looking at. She turned to look, but found nothing unusual, starting to suspect it was her imagination. Grace gently tugged on Benjamin's clothes and asked if he wouldn't mind if she went to greet the Saintess Aria. Benjamin seemed very surprised when Grace mentioned Aria, but it wasn't a negative expression. Grace pondered how to describe Benjamin's expression. She thought he looked somewhat at a loss, like someone who had waited a long time and was finally facing what they had been waiting for. Seeing the expression on Benjamin's face, Grace's breath caught. However, she chose to ignore the reason for her shortness of breath, as dealing with her current emotions was already challenging enough for her. Benjamin replied that she could go. So Grace removed the pendant with the presence-lowering magic tool from her cloak, deliberately letting others notice their presence. Then, she and Benjamin slowly walked towards where Aria and Sylvester were. Aria and Sylvester sensed their approach and separated in surprise. Grace apologized, saying that she and Benjamin were just out for a walk and noticed someone nearby. In reality, she had used her knowledge of the original story to deliberately seek out Aria. Grace then apologized, asking if she was disturbing them, and said they would pass by quickly. She had thought Aria would probably respond that there was no need to apologize and that they should enjoy enjoy their time there. After all, Aria was the type of person who disliked inconveniencing others with her actions. However, Aria's actual response was vastly different from what Grace had expected. Aria enthusiastically said she wasn't disturbed at all and even asked them to stay. Aria's enthusiasm far exceeded her expectations. Grace wondered if she should take this as a good sign. Aria eagerly, even insistently, suggested they stay, her eyes sparkling and her face flushed with excitement. Grace couldn't help but wonder why Aria was being so hospitable. After all, she wasn't the only woman her age in the expedition team. The intimate atmosphere that had existed between Aria and Sylvester vanished. Now, Aria exuded a strong aura of wanted chat. A person like her was at a disadvantage in public social settings because it was hard for her to hide her intentions. Grace guessed that perhaps Aria was too shy to say it directly because Sylvester and Benjamin were nearby. Grace thoughtfully rolled her eyes and gave Benjamin a look, indicating to him that she had something she wanted to discuss privately with the Saintess Aria. Aria asked Grace if she had been in frequent contact with something recently. Grace once again showed a confused expression. Aria explained that when she arrived at the Rondel Canal, she had sensed the contamination. Even if it's not visible to the naked eye, when the contamination is severe, I can feel it. So I immediately release my divine power. Aria continued, then from a distance, I saw the black mist around Grace dissipate. Grace was surprised and said, "What?" She felt this didn't match what she knew. But Grace nodded again, recalling the golden power she had seen that day. She thought, even if Aria is the saintess, especially when it comes to handling curses, according to the information I know from the novel setting, the novel stated that to lift a curse, direct contact is necessary. But isn't Sylvester the only one directly cursed? Aria looked at the pensive Grace and after a moment said, also, that day, I saw the black mist around Grace dissipate. But when I saw her again here, she was once again shrouded in black mist. Hearing this, Grace let out a surprised ah. She didn't want to keep responding like this, but she couldn't think of any other reaction at the moment. Aria continued, the curse on Sylvester, the crown prince, has never worsened. A curse can't be lifted all at once, but I can clearly see it lessening. However, in the Duchess's case, the curse was completely lifted, but today she is shrouded in black mist again. After hearing this, Grace understood. So, Aria meant that it looked similar to Sylvester, the crown prince. Aria affirmed this. Grace became curious about Aria's intentions and asked why Aria was telling her this, wondering if it was some kind of proposal. After all, whatever it was could determine her next course of action. But Aria's response was not a proposal. Aria said, I feel an energy in you that is similar to my own. Grace wondered what Aria was talking about. Then Aria said, I was thinking maybe Grace possesses divine power. Upon hearing this, Grace's jaw nearly dropped. She had never heard any suggestion that she possessed any divine power. Besides, since there was already one saintess, the possibility of another one appearing was almost zero. Grace glanced at Aria, who was standing cautiously beside her, and thought, it's just as I thought. Aria was just as naive and kind as described in the original story. Although she herself might seem a bit suspicious, she still tactfully asked Aria, are the saintess and His Highness the Crown Prince very close? Aria replied, ah yes, he has helped me a lot. I consider him a good friend. Grace suggested they head back. Aria agreed. Grace then said she hoped they could meet again in the future. Upon hearing this, Aria's face visibly brightened with joy. She said she had also been wanting to see Grace, but their schedules never aligned. She had even considered asking His Highness the Crown Prince for help. Grace was curious about the method of asking the Crown Prince for help, but resisted the urge to ask. As previously agreed, after completing the expedition, the personnel from the Duchy of Felton separated from the expedition team and headed to Viscount Linden's territory. A knight asked Grace if something was troubling her. Grace replied no, she just wanted to catch the train quickly. Grace called for Sally, but the knights were in an uproar. Grace muttered to herself, her face turning redder than her hair, it's nothing important, just asking Sally to get me a newspaper. She desperately needed something to distract herself. There was a slight delay in getting the newspaper, but fortunately, she got it before the train departed. Grace mentioned that the newspaper had crossword and number puzzles, which were good for passing the time. She also said that the newspaper reported on many terrible, even tragic, events that were not mentioned in the novel. This moved her deeply. She was about to recount what she had read, more cruel incidents than she had expected, and a kidnapping case. But just then, the carriage suddenly jolted violently, and the interior shook. Benjamin was clearly flustered. He asked with concern if Grace was all right. Grace replied that she was fine, thanks to Benjamin. Eventually, the carriage stopped. Benjamin was the first to get out and extended a hand to Grace, suggesting that since they were not far from the Viscount's estate, they should go for a stroll in the market. At this time of year, merchants would stay for a long time at Viscount Linden's estate. This was the golden season for the Viscount's estate to make money, almost like a festival. In the eyes of most residents of the Viscounty, this period was even better than the actual festivals. This was a difference in perception formed by infrastructure. Grace and Benjamin chatted, with Grace mentioning that it wouldn't be as lively as the festivals in the capital, as it was on a smaller scale. Benjamin, however, said, but it will still be more interesting than the Northern Night. Grace replied that it was a bit unfair for Benjamin to say that. Benjamin laughed at her response. Escorted by Benjamin, Grace stepped out of the carriage. A familiar sight greeted her. Viscount Linden's estate was located in the southwest and was quite remote. It wasn't actually a trade center. However, this remoteness had coincidentally saved it from the control of large trade guilds. Grace pondered whether this place attracted merchants with unique goods or those looking to offload less popular items. These factors intertwined, causing Viscount Linden's estate to have relatively active merchant trade, but lagging overall development. She also thought that perhaps they could earn more money by developing tourism based on the local lake's legend. In any case, Viscount Linden's estate was very fortunate not to have been affected by the Western contamination incident. The land was still full of life, and the residents' faces were beaming with joy. Grace sighed that this was truly a blessing. After all, the Viscount's main asset was his land. Grace looked around and walked toward the nearest stall. The merchant saw Grace constantly looking over his shop and grinned widely, his expression like that of a fisherman who had just seen a fish bite the hook. He then enthusiastically greeted Grace, asking if there was anything she wanted to know about. Grace asked what that fruit was. The merchant told her that the fruit was from the kingdom of Arcia and was called Skasand fruit. Grace pointed at the Skasand fruit and asked if she could try one. Benjamin, alarmed by her action, cried out, "Madam!" The merchant said of course she could, adding that the fruit was absolutely non-toxic and not to worry. He took out a fresh fruit and handed it to her. Ignoring Benjamin's concern, she popped the fresh Skasand fruit into her mouth. A peculiar taste spread across her taste buds. She made a hum sound. The people beside her hurriedly asked if she was all right, worried that there was something wrong with the fruit. After tasting it, Grace felt the fruit was a little sweet, slightly salty, and mainly sour. It wasn't bitter when chewed, and a tingling sourness lingered on her tongue. She recognized the taste as being like an omega berry. She wondered why this kind of fruit had suddenly appeared here, and for a moment she felt detached from the story setting. Then she said that she actually quite liked the taste and continued to chew and savor it. Benjamin noticed her hesitation and told the merchant he would buy all of these fruits. The merchant was shocked by this. Benjamin then said he wanted all the seedlings too. The merchant, astonished, addressed Benjamin as my lord. Benjamin asked the merchant if there was a special method for growing this fruit. If you know, tell Abram who is following behind, he said, gesturing for Aberton to come closer. Grace asked if my lord intended to buy everything. Benjamin said they should use a different form of address here. Grace tried changing her address for Benjamin, calling him Benny. Benjamin remembered the previous masquerade ball and smiled in satisfaction as a response. He then explained that he planned to distribute the fruit to the orphanage's tea garden and to Adele's territory to see which place was more suitable for cultivation. Grace felt this was a bit over the top. To her, it was like the chairman of a large corporation they sponsored suddenly handing them something perplexing and asking them to grow a difficult crop. She felt a little guilty. Benjamin sensed Grace's unease and explained that they could consider this as sponsorship funds. If the cultivation went well, it might turn into commercial capital. After hearing this, Grace responded with an ah, not particularly satisfied. Grace held a bag of dried Skasand fruit, wondering if the people of this world would like this kind of fruit, a puzzled expression on her face. Someone asked if something was troubling her. She replied, not at all. The lady of Linden Manor prepared to welcome her guests. First, she was startled by the guests arriving on foot rather than by carriage. Then, she was even more surprised by the large amount of things they were carrying. The lady of the house remarked that it looked like the guests had a lot of fun. "I'm glad you could return before sunset," she said. Benjamin replied, "The night view must be beautiful. It's a shame to have missed it." The lady of the house paused for a moment before saying, "There will be plenty of time to enjoy it in the future." Grace clutched the bouquet in her hand and looked around. The lady of Linden Manor and Benjamin greeted each other, and then she turned to Grace with a warm smile and said, "It seems Grace had a pleasant time. Your love for flowers is as strong as ever." Grace affirmed with a yes. Grace informed her mother, Lady Linden, that because she and my lord had snacks at the market, they might eat dinner a little later, and asked if that was all right. Lady Linden replied that in that case, they would just push back dinner time a bit. After entering the house, a huge portrait above the central staircase caught Grace's eye. The portrait depicted the entire Linden family, including the daughters who had already married out. It looked like it was painted before Benjamin proposed to Grace. Grace thought they didn't see the painting in the new portrait of the lovers. In the painting, she stood like an ugly duckling next to her beautiful and perfect siblings. Grace had mixed feelings. In the painting, her father's arm was around her shoulder and she was holding her sister's hand. But for some reason, she still felt uncomfortable, thinking it must be because of her inferiority complex. At the end of the scene, Grace averted her gaze and looked at the back of her mother walking ahead. It always felt wrong when she was next to Benjamin. Grace realized that at this moment, she was walking side by side with Benjamin. This should have been obvious. She suddenly thought, wait a minute. Usually, when a married couple visits as guests, they are only given one room. Lady Linden told them that compared to the ducal estate, her home might seem humble, but she urged them not to be formal and to make themselves at home. Grace replied that it didn't feel humble at all and said it looked really nice, meaning it was very cozy. Upon entering the room, there was, naturally, only one bed. Grace secretly glanced at Benjamin's face beside her and saw that his face looked like it would turn beet red at any moment. Somehow, Grace's own face started to feel inexplicably hot as well. Lady Linden, seemingly unaware of the strange tension between the two, left the room with a satisfied smile, leaving behind an awkward silence. Grace's heart began to beat irregularly fast. The awkward atmosphere was suffocating. She desperately wanted to break the silence. Benjamin spoke first, asking if he should go ask the Viscount and Viscountess or the butler for another room. Grace replied in a small voice that there was no need, explaining that there probably weren't any spare rooms. Considering the entourage brought from the Duchy of Felton, the current situation, and all the guests, it was very likely there weren't enough rooms. After considering the size of the manor, Benjamin slowly nodded in agreement.